Section 26 of the Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 12, by Agnes and Elisabeth Strickland. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Anne, Chapter 11, Part 2. At the head of the partisans for the restoration of her family, the Queen distinguished her kinsman, the great Duke of Hamilton, on whom she meant to bestow the honor of concluding the peace, as her ambassador to France. In September 1712, Queen Anne made the Duke of Hamilton Master General of the Ordnance, and, in addition to the Order of the Thistle, originally bestowed on him by her father, James II, Her Majesty thought proper to make him a Knight of the Garter at a chapter held at Windsor. It was remarked to the Queen that the case was without precedent, and that no two such distinct orders had ever been worn by any subject, to which the Queen replied, "Such a subject as the Duke of Hamilton has a preeminent claim to every mark of distinction which a crowned head can confer. I will henceforth wear both orders myself." Lockhart of Carnwath, the Duke's schoolfellow and bosom friend, gives a somewhat different version of this anecdote of Queen Anne. "Just before the intended departure of the Duke for France," says Lockhart, "the Queen's favour was shown to him by the offer of the Garter. The Duke positively refused it, unless the Queen would permit him to wear the Order of the Thistle with it, telling Her Majesty plainly, that he would never lay aside a Scotch honour to make way for an English one," adding significantly, "Your Majesty's royal father, James II, wore both at the same time." His observation not only prevailed on Queen Anne to permit him to do the like, but from that moment she did so herself. An anecdote of costume which seems to have escaped the learned in the orders of chivalry. A personal portrait of this great noble and prince of the blood is thus drawn by an enemy of his party, the Whig spy Mackay. "The Duke of Hamilton is brave in his person, with a rough air of boldness, of good sense, very forward and hot for what he undertakes, ambitious and haughty, a violent enemy, has been very extravagant in his manner of living, but now grows covetous. He is supposed to have some thoughts towards the crown of Scotland when the Queen dies, being descended from the house of Stuart, and having great interest in that kingdom. He has a great estate, and 3 brothers earls, being Selkirk, Orkney, and Ruglen, and a 4th, a sea commander. The Duke of Hamilton is of middle stature, very well made, of a coarse black complexion, towards 50 years of age." To this sketch Swift added, "The Duke of Hamilton was a most worthy, good-natured man, very generous, but of a middle understanding. Murdered by the villain Macartney." The adventures of the youth of the Duke of Hamilton present one of those romances of real life wherein the facts of historical biography, preserved peradventure only in the rolls of family heralds or in the archives of a family monument chest, surpass the invention of the authors of fiction. The following narrative, in which Queen Anne's eldest sister, Mary II, played a conspicuous part, is collected merely from genealogical memorials. James, Earl of Arran, afterwards Duke of Hamilton, having, after the death of his first wife, Anne Spencer, in 1690, seduced Lady Barbara Fitzroy, the youngest daughter of Charles II, by the Duchess of Cleveland. Under the promise of marriage, she bore a son to him at Cleveland House, St. James's, the 30th of March, 1691, during his confinement in the Tower, where he was thrown by the warrant of Queen Mary II. That queen and his mother, the Duchess of Hamilton, were so incensed at the discovery of this intrigue as to make the banishment of the unfortunate girl, then only in her 18th year, to the Continent the only condition of his release. Lady Barbara was accordingly forced to abandon her infant, and retired to the convent of Pontoise in France, where she afterwards died. It would have been more in consistency with the angelic characteristics attributed to Queen Mary if she had used her power for the purpose of inducing the Earl of Arran to repair his wrongs, in some measure, by a legal marriage with his victim, the daughter of her uncle Charles, than to drive her into a foreign land and a conventual prison. If Queen Anne ever cherished either hopes or intentions of making her unfortunate brother her successor, they perished and became abortive when her friend, the Duke of Hamilton, was slain or murdered on the fatal Sunday, November 15, 1712, at the time of his encounter with Lord Mohun in a combat of 4 in Hyde Park. A tradition exists in Scotland that a secret agreement had taken place between the widowed queen of James II and the great Duke of Hamilton, that Lord Arran, his heir, was to receive in marriage the hand of the Princess Louisa Stuart, youngest daughter of James II and sister to Queen Anne. Whether the bride was to be as reward for the active services of the great Duke in the restoration of the brother, whether Queen Anne ever knew of this project, must remain unsolved. Death had decided the history of that young princess in the preceding spring. All hopes and fears, says the Duke of Hamilton's friend Lockhart, vanished by his fatal death, which by reasons of the critical juncture when it happened, and some things very extraordinary in the manner of it, made then a great noise. There was at the court of Anne a titled homicide and profligate called Lord Mohun, who had been twice tried for his life for murdering men of low degree in the state of furious intoxication which was prevalent at that period. The first victim was poor Montford, the player. A more unprovoked piece of cruelty was never recorded on any state trial. It was without excuse, excepting what the titled criminal pleaded, that he was utterly unconscious of time, place, and existence when it occurred. The Duke of Hamilton and Lord Mohun had married ladies of the house of Gerard, and bitter enmity ensued between them on account of some property then litigated in Chancery, to which the ladies were co-heiresses. They met at the examination of some witnesses, and quarrelled furiously. The Duke of Hamilton, supposed to be at that time deeply pledged to the Queen, relative to negotiations for her brother's restoration, endured much from the furious temper of Mohun, being resolved to keep himself out of all engagements likely to impede his exertions in that cause. And, moreover, suspecting that Mohun, who was known to be no personal hero when sober, was exasperated and irritated purposely by the opposite party, in hopes of exciting a fatal fray. Be this as it may, a challenge was sent by Mohun to the Duke, who considered himself bound to accept it. Of all the days in the week, Sunday morning was the time appointed for this combat, which seems to be the last of that remarkable species, where the seconds were expected to engage as well as the principals, and fight to the death. Such had been the usage in France in the preceding century, in the minorities of Louis XIII and XIV. 11 combatants on a side have been known to enter into mortal conflict, and 10 or 12 were often left dead on the spot, victims to some trifle light as air, taken amiss by 2 young petulant nobles, some obeisance forgotten, some precedence mistaken, or even some glance construed into contempt. The proceedings of the Duke of Hamilton would be inexplicable without this explanation, for people in these days sometimes hear of duels between 2 principals, but not of so bellicose a spirit reigning among the seconds and other witnesses. Hyde Park was then a wild track, reaching to the gravel walk before Kensington Palace, broken into marshy thickets where the Serpentine now flows. That piece of water then wound deviously as a rushy rivulet, which, here and there, became stagnant in pools, near which were usually chosen fighting grounds for those who had affairs of honour to settle. Behind a thicket of the Serpentine brook did the great Duke of Hamilton, with his kinsman and friend, Colonel Hamilton, meet Lord Mohun and the Whig general, Macartney, in the dawn of a November Sunday. Mohun really behaved the most rationally of the 2 opponents, for whilst he and the Duke were throwing off their coats for the encounter, he observed, that he hoped those 2 gentlemen's seconds were only to look on and not be personally concerned in any part of the quarrel. The Duke answered, that he believed Mr. Macartney was the chief occasion of their coming on this errand, and since it was so, he had brought an old friend of that person to entertain him with a share of the dance. All 4 immediately flashed out their swords and fell to work. Colonel Hamilton soon disarmed Macartney, and looking about to see what had become of the other combatants, He perceived Lord Mohun lying on his back, dead or expiring. The Duke of Hamilton had fallen on his face on Lord Mohun. Colonel Hamilton instantly flung down his own sword and that of Macartney, of which he had just obtained full possession, and ran and lifted up the Duke of Hamilton, who he saw was wounded in 2 places, and faint with effusion of blood. Whilst performing this friendly office, Macartney took up one of the swords, and coming behind Hamilton, as he supported the Duke in his arms, he stabbed his Grace, who walked, nevertheless, some little way to a tree, where he soon after expired. The park keepers came up at that moment, and Macartney fled. Colonel Hamilton, alarmed, he said, at being found with the corpses of 2 great nobles, followed his example. But he ever protested that the Duke of Hamilton was not slain, but assassinated after the fight was done. The proof he alleged was, that if the Duke had been wounded to death with his opponent's sword, the orifice of the wound would have been different, since Mohun fought with a Saxon blade, which was left in his dead hand, whereas the Duke's death wound had a 3-cornered orifice. It was, said Colonel Hamilton, done with my own sword, which I had cast on the ground unwittingly, with one of Macartney's, which I had captured, when I flew to aid my noble kinsman. Dr. Garth, before the matter was made a furious party question with the Whigs, affirmed, on the word of a medical man, that it was utterly impossible for Lord Mohun to have given Hamilton the death wound, which must have been inflicted by someone standing above him. This agreed with Colonel Hamilton's statement. Whatever occasioned this dismal double homicide, it is certain that with it ended the rational hopes of the Stuarts, for if Queen Anne ever meant to aid her brother, it was certainly to have been done by the means of the Duke of Hamilton. She was oppressed and stupefied with grief for the loss of the Duke of Hamilton. He preceded her to the grave only a few months, and the very report that spread on all sides, that the Whigs had suborned Macartney, first to urge Mohun to challenge him, and then to stab him in the midst of the fray, was sufficient to have intimidated a woman hastening to the tomb. The Queen was importuned by her ministry to nominate Dr. Swift to the see of Hereford, the object of his ardent ambition. The Queen, unacquainted with the literature of her own age or of any other, only knew Swift as a partisan of High Church, and as the deputy on whom her clergy of the Church Establishment of Ireland regarded sufficiently to send up to her throne to crave her extension of the bounty of first fruits, a favour which Anne had graciously granted, accompanied by some complacent notice of the deputy of her Irish Church. The Duchess of Somerset, finding the disposition of her royal mistress's mind, provided herself with an influential ally, being Dr. Sharp, Archbishop of York, a very favourite prelate with Anne, who had preached by her express desire the sermon at her coronation. At the moment when the Queen consulted the Archbishop of York as to nominating Dr. Swift to the see of Hereford, the Archbishop startled her with the following pithy question. Ought not your sacred majesty to be first certain whether Dr. Swift is a Christian before he becomes a bishop? The Queen, in consternation, demanded his reasons for doubting the Christianity of the nominee of her ministry for the see of Hereford. The Archbishop, in support of his assertion, had armed himself with the work that founded Swift's fame as a wit and great literary power, and good Queen Anne, to her infinite horror and astonishment, was first introduced to the polemic romance called The Tale of a Tub. The false axiom adopted by the deists and atheists of that age, that ridicule is the test of truth, seems to have inspired the author or authors of this controversial tale. It levels its satire at every denomination of Christianity, and stands at the head of the evil and perverse class of controversial novels, by which polemics of every creed have endeavoured to persecute their rival sects, since the use of fire and faggots, the quartering block and polemic preaching, have been renounced and abhorred by good Christians in general. While Queen Anne stood aghast at the profanity which a glance at the lucubrations of the divine she was about to nominate her bishop must have displayed to her, her mistress of the robes advanced on her other side, and throwing herself at her feet, and showing the Windsor prophecy, implored with tears, that her royal mistress would not prefer to the sacred office of a bishop of souls a man capable of disseminating such false witness against an innocent lady. Poor Queen Anne, after perusing this string of slanderous puns addressed to herself, was scandalized and ashamed of the deeds of the wolf in sheep's clothing she was about to appoint as a shepherd in the fold of her church. Her Majesty firmly withheld her royal veto from the nominee of her ministry, and as to the See of Hereford, as the Whigs were not then in power, the head of the Church of England this time was not coerced into the relinquishment of that legal right for which she stood responsible to her Church, to her people, and to her God. There stood by one, silently noting this curious scene, who had, with more good sense than history has given her credit for, exactly foretold to the reckless wit what would befall, if in the vanity of literary power he made public his attack on the great lady, as the Duchess of Somerset was called, at the court of Queen Anne. For the Queen never forgot the gratitude she owed to the friendship of the Duchess of Somerset when she fearlessly espoused her cause against the cruelty of her sister, Queen Mary. Lady Masham described all she had seen and heard to her friend, Dr. Swift. The truth of the matter of his disappointment was forthwith authenticated by his subsequent angry lines, in which he calls the Archbishop a crazy prelate, and Anne a royal prude. And limiting his rage to these slight reproaches on Church and Queen, he flew with the whole fury of his wrath at the unfortunate Duchess, and made matters against her appear far more in earnest than in his Windsor prophecy. Now angry Somerset her vengeance vows on Swift's reproaches for her murdered spouse. From her red locks her mouth with venom fills, and thence into the royal ear instills. The Queen incensed, his services forgot, leaves him a victim to the vengeful Scot. Now through the realm a proclamation spread, to fix a price on his devoted head. Whilst innocent, he scorned ignoble flight. His watchful friends preserve him by a slight. His watchful friends must have considered him almost as troublesome as the spirit evoked by Michael Scott, who perpetually did embarrassing mischief after he had executed with marvellous celerity the task for which he had been conjured up. Michael Scott set his over-industrious elf to twist ropes out of sand, and the Oxford ministry made Dr. Swift Dean of St. Patrick's, which banished him to Ireland, where he expended his mighty energies in grappling with the amplitude of wrong he found there on every side. He says, but the accuser of the Duchess of Somerset ought not to be believed on his word without corroborating evidence, that the Archbishop of York sent to entreat his pardon for having prejudiced the Queen against him. York is from Lambeth, sent to show the Queen a dangerous treatise writ against the spleen, which by the style, the manner, and the drift, 'tis thought could be the work of none but Swift. Poor York, the harmless tool of others' hate, he sues for pardon and repents too late. The influence of the Duchess of Somerset with the Queen, it plainly appears by this incident, was all-powerful. Her Majesty considered the Duchess of Somerset as a counterpoise to the Tory party in power, being often inspired, it is supposed, by the Duchess, with apprehensions lest she should one day see her brother walk into the council room and suddenly behold her regal homage transferred by her ministers to him before her face. St. John, who was in the Jacobite interest, was particularly anxious to disencumber the household of such an impediment to their operations as the Duchess of Somerset. As for the Duke, it will be remembered, he personally defied the Queen at council by calling Harley, the minister of her choice, a fellow to her face. There had been no particular difficulty in dislodging him, but it was his Duchess they dreaded. "For," said the Tory party, "she is insinuating and a woman of intrigue, and will do what harm she can to Secretary St. John." The Queen constantly replied, "If it were so that I cannot have what servants I like, I do not see how my condition is mended." Since the fall of the family junta, Her Majesty meant. The Duke of Somerset, it is said by Swift, intended to withdraw his duchess from court, out of spite for his own dismissal, but the queen prevailed on her to remain in office by writing to her a letter of entreaty for that purpose, making her compliance a personal favour, which letter the Duke of Somerset very frequently showed to his friends. Secretary St. John was the particular object of the Duchess of Somerset's mistrust and opposition. The queen's long-cherished, but oft-deferred hopes of peace were about to be realized with the opening of the year 1713. The tears that had often streamed from her eyes over the appalling lists of slain and wounded in the mere glory battles of Blenheim and Ramillies were at last to fall no more. For many years, Anne had been the only person connected with the government of her country who was steadily desirous of peace. She was not, however, destined long to reign over England when her great object was attained. The fierce contests which had attended the expulsion of the junta that had identified war with their interest shook her sands of life rudely, and all but those who saw her daily knew well that the time of Anne Stuart could not be long. Infirmity had frequently touched her at the early age of 30. It had been noted how she was carried from one place to another as a cripple, but she occasionally recovered the use of her feet and limbs with strength sufficient to permit her to follow the stag in her long hunting drives, which she continued till the summer of 1712. All violent exercise was, perforce, renounced in the succeeding year. The queen was not only rendered inert with gout, but that disorder was not disposed to limit its attacks to her limbs. On every change of weather, or at any mental agitation of the royal patient, it made formidable incursions on the vitals. The queen appointed the Duke of Shrewsbury her ambassador extraordinary to complete the treaty of peace at Paris. When there, the Parisians were highly amused by the Norman motto of the Talbots, Presse d'accomplir, which being emblazoned on his coaches, they chose to consider was an allusion to his pacific mission, and that he meant to accomplish hastily a treaty which had lingered for 2 years. When the treaty of peace was actually signed by the plenipotentiaries at Utrecht, the French ambassador, the Duc d'Aumont, arrived in London and had his first audience with Queen Anne. Her Majesty apologized to him for being unable to rise to return his salutation, but begged him to be covered as he stood with his hat in his hand. According to the custom of ambassadors, he should have put it on as soon as she had acknowledged his first address. The courteous envoy refused to avail himself of this privilege, observing, "That the king his master would not himself have worn his hat in the presence of so great a queen, and therefore he could not." He remained uncovered during the whole of the audience. "I know not," said Queen Mary Beatrice, when relating this incident to the Abbess of Chaillot, "how this will be taken by the other ambassadors, who are always jealous of their masters' dignities, or whether this compliment may not be hereafter cited as a precedent for depriving the representatives of foreign kings of the privilege of putting on their hats. It must, however, be regarded as a mark of politeness of the king your master, who is the most courteous man in the world, and has always paid me the compliment of remaining uncovered in my presence, although I have often entreated him not to use such ceremonies with us." Louis XIV, who always considered his homage was a woman's right, and never passed a female, even of the humblest degree, without touching his hat to her, had undoubtedly directed his representative to treat Queen Anne with the like respect, as a mark of gallant attention due to her sex. The Duc d'Aumont addressed the most flattering language to Queen Anne in his speeches, telling her that her reign was as glorious as that of Queen Elizabeth, and he hoped it would be as long. His Excellency did not confine his civilities to bows and compliments, for he presented her with the 9 beautiful grey Flemish horses, with which he had made his public entrance into London, and this was the first gift that had been offered to a sovereign of England by a French ambassador for nearly half a century. Some anxiety prevailed as to the person among the clever men and wits surrounding the Lord Treasurer, Harley, Earl of Oxford, as to who was to compose the speech with which their queen was to open her parliament. The difference between such announcements and the personality that the Plantagenet, the Tudor, and even the Stuart monarchs threw into their speeches is not a little remarkable. Those of Queen Elizabeth were no matters for men to jest withal, when their glasses went round, according to the following instance. After dinner, Lord Treasurer was talking to the Lords about the speech that the Queen must make when Parliament meets. He asked me, continues Dr. Swift seriously, "How can I make it?" I turned it into a jest, and because they had been speaking of the recent event of the Duchess of Marlborough going to Flanders after the Duke, I said, "The Queen's speech should begin thus. My lords and gentlemen, in order to my own quiet, and that of my good subjects, I have thought fit to send abroad the Duchess of Marlborough after her Duke." The Queen, however, could pronounce none of her speeches, whether compounded for her in joke or earnest. Her Majesty was seriously ill, and the Parliament in consequence prorogued. She was well enough to receive her company when her birthday arrived. "I never," resumed Swift, "saw the birthday celebrated with so much bustle and fine clothes. Pray God keep the Queen. She was very ill about 10 days ago, and had the gout in her stomach." A few days after he says, "There were more Whigs than Tories today at court. I believe they see the peace must be made, and come to look after the Queen. She is still lame with gout." Her physicians had succeeded in driving the disorder from the vitals to the extremities. The Queen had made a struggle with her failing health to appear to her people on her birthday, which was kept as a national holiday with enthusiasm, which almost amounted to transport. Long after this well-beloved English queen had passed away, a rhyme was repeated by the populace nearly through the last century, when every February 6th came round. "Good Queen Anne's birthday, all bells ringing gay." Relapses took place of her dangerous malady after the Queen had held her birthday court. She was seldom able to attend divine service at St. James's Chapel, and when she did, she was carried in a low open chair. It was observed that she had an ugly cough. A German lady belonging to the court of Queen Anne, having taken the privilege of her Protestant country, which permits knitting in sermon time at church, greatly scandalized Steele, who, in one of his papers in the Guardian, reprobates such proceedings at St. James's Chapel during divine service, because the irreverent knitter was then in the immediate presence of God and her Majesty, who were both affronted together. "The health of her Majesty is slowly mending," proceeds Swift. "She intends to be brought in a chair to her Parliament when it meets, which will not be until March 3rd. March ran through. April came, and yet the long-delayed royal speech had not been spoken. The continuation of alarming symptoms delayed it. The gout vibrated fearfully through the Queen's frame, flying from her feet to her stomach. At last, being carried in an open chair, on the 9th of April, to the House of Lords, her Majesty pronounced her speech with her usual harmony of utterance, yet it was noted that her voice was weaker than usual. Vast crowds blocked every avenue to the House of Lords, for her speech announced peace, after 11 years' warfare of unparalleled bloodshed. Indeed, the war had continued since 1688, with very short cessation. England had not been engaged in a continental war of any such duration or consequence since the days of Henry VI. The Treaty of Utrecht had actually been signed by the plenipotentiaries on the preceding 31st of March, 1713. The transition from peace to war, even in the present era of superior moral wisdom in the guidance of political statistics, has always proved a period of the utmost difficulty to the sovereign and ministry of this country. There can be no doubt but that anxieties on account of the peace shortened the life of Queen Anne. Moreover, it was impossible for the negotiation to proceed to any length without the recurrence of agitating reminiscences of all that had been transacted by the Queen in her early days at the Revolution. The difficult question which had at first presented itself still perplexed the high contracting powers. This was, what was to be done with Queen Anne's unfortunate brother, the Chevalier de St. George? The recognition of the Queen's title by Louis XIV implied the necessity of the young prince's retreat to some other friendly dominions. There exists an autograph letter of Anne, written in stiff but grammatical French, in the collections of the King of France, supposed to refer to this subject. The letter has seemed by others to refer merely to the restoration of her next nearest relative, the Duke of Savoy, to some part of his dominions, of which he had been deprived during the war. Probably this ambiguity had been carefully concerted by Prior and Bolingbroke. Monsieur mon frère, I have received, with sincere pleasure, the agreeable letter that the Sieur Prior brought me on your part. As your consummate prudence has taken the most proper resolution for fixing the terms of the peace, you may be persuaded, on my side, I shall lose not a moment to accelerate its conclusion. I assure you, the manner in which you remind me to be incessantly employed in re-establishing the public tranquillity is not lost upon me. By the orders I have given to my ministers at Utrecht, I have done all that is possible in the present juncture in favor of a prince, whose interests are sustained by your generosity. I doubt not that he will be fully convinced of this himself, and that all the world will agree in the same. I repeat yet, monsieur my brother, that the consideration of your friendship will be a motive very effective to engage me for the future in his interests and in those of his family, according to the occasions which may present themselves in future. As to the rest, I have sent Prior to Versailles, who will continue to hold the course of conduct most agreeable to you, and will do naught but execute to the letter the orders with which I have charged him. And among all the proofs of his duty and his zeal for my service, I have charged him very particularly to take all occasions possible to repeat the very perfect esteem and consideration which I have for you, and the ardent desire I have to live with you in sincere and perfect amity. I pray God to send you long years of health and prosperity, and to hold you always in his holy care. I am, monsieur my brother, your good sister, Anne R. Queen Anne offered the Order of the Garter to Louis XIV as soon as the Peace of Utrecht was concluded. The king declined accepting it, lest Queen Mary Beatrice should be offended. He had already received the order from Anne's father or uncle. The possession of Gibraltar, a fragment reft from the train of Spain in the long contest of her succession war, is the only remnant of the costly conquests of the reign of Anne, retained by Great Britain at the present day. It is worthy of remark that this possession was no trophy of the specious conquests of Marlborough, for his duchess went almost insane with pride and anger, and led the poor queen a doleful life for some months, because the Houses of Parliament voted thanks to Sir George Rooke for taking Gibraltar, on the same day on which they thanked the Duke of Marlborough for Blenheim. The rock has been retained, at whatsoever cost, on account of the protection it afforded to English trade in the Mediterranean, being much better situated for that purpose than Tangier, for the retention of which a struggle was made in the preceding century. Louis XIV added to Anne the possession of Newfoundland, but that island was the lawful property of her ancestors, Henry VII having given the magnificent sum of £10 to the man that discovered the isle. Continental conquest was an absurd and guilty dream, which still infatuated the public, and had done so for 300 years. It was considered extremely convenient to hold a port on an opposite coast, where an invading army might disembark, to carry fire and sword through a neighboring land. Calais was held for 200 and odd years for this purpose. It has been found that 1/3 of the English revenue was dispersed to maintain it, which money found its way over the continent of France and did not circulate back into England. Moreover, every sedition connected with the civil wars of York and Lancaster, which produced insurrection in England, was concocted at Calais. The English were displeased because the ministry of Queen Anne did not insist, at the Peace of Utrecht, on the restoration of Dunkirk. The statesmen who coveted the unlawful possession of such towns as Calais and Dunkirk had yet to learn the mighty statistical truth conveyed in the noble words of Campbell. Britannia needs no bastions, no towers along the steep. Her marches o'er the mountain waves, her home is on the deep. Surely it was far wiser to maintain an irresistible navy to sweep pirates from the face of the British seas, even if it cost a third of the revenue, for the floating fortresses brought back the capital spent on them, which Calais or Dunkirk never could. Henry VIII nearly rendered his country bankrupt by conquering and adding to the English territory Boulogne and 2 or 3 other sinks to national wealth and prosperity. They were given up in a few years, with the humiliating conviction that such gains proved in the end pretty considerable losses. Conquerors learned these lessons, but learned them too late. It has been previously shown that the statue of Queen Anne in St. Paul's churchyard, little as it is heeded in the present day, was chosen by her political poets to perform the same office as the Pasquin and Marforio statues at Rome. The following verses, acknowledged by the Whig doctor, Sir Samuel Garth, unlike his former libellous epigrams on Anne, possess some degree of reproachful elegance on the subject of the Peace of Utrecht. Near the vast bulk of that stupendous frame, known by the Gentiles' great apostle's name, with grace divine, great Anna's seen to rise, an awful form that glads a nation's eyes. Beneath her feet 4 mighty realms appear, with due reverence pay their homage there. Britain and Ireland seem to owe her grace, and e'en wild India wears a smiling face. But France alone, with downcast eyes, is seen, the sad attendant of so good a queen. Ungrateful country, to forget so soon all that great Anna for thy sake has done. When, sworn the kind defender of thy cause, spite of her dear religion, spite of laws, for thee she sheathed the terrors of her sword, for thee she broke her general and her word, for thee her mind in doubtful terms she told, and learned to speak like oracles of old. For thee alone, what could she more? She lost the honor that her arms had won, such Caesar never knew, nor Philip's son. Resigned the glories of a 10 years' reign, such as none but Marlborough's arm could gain. For thee in annals she's content to shine, like any other of the Stuart line. Scarcely, for unlike her ancestors, Queen Anne founded no colonies, while the corruptions attendant on her peculating government laid the foundation for the alienation of the most noble of their colonial states. Her navy was disastrously impaired instead of advancing with the impetus her father's labors had given it. The education of the poor was utterly neglected. Perhaps one of the most extraordinary features of the age was that after the 2 revolutions of the 17th century, especially that of 1688, numerous existing endowments for the instruction of the lower classes were seized upon by the middle classes, whilst those devoted to educate clergymen from the children of the people were appropriated by the aristocracy of wealth to the education of their sons. Anne's ancestors likewise shone without a national debt. To do Queen Anne justice, this order of affairs agonized her very soul, and induced her strenuous efforts for the peace which so highly incensed the revolutionary party. The Queen about the same period addressed a letter to the Archbishop of Canterbury, requesting him to rectify the abuses of charity schools, but her appeal was unavailing. Some persons, excited into rage at the Garth pasquinades on Anne's statue, broke the scepter and defaced the ornaments as soon as peace was proclaimed. End of section 26. Section 27 of the Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 12, by Agnes and Elisabeth Strickland. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Anne, Chapter 11, Part 3. If the true history of the wars of the 17th and the beginning of the 18th century, on pretense of sustaining the balance of power, could have been read aright by the people of Great Britain, France, and Spain, it would be soon found that the homely proverb of "Mind first your own business" is as wholesome a maxim for nations as for families. That Great Britain had not minded her own business during the Orange and Marlborough Wars could be told by many a woeful token, especially by the misery, ignorance, and consequent wickedness of the poor, by the dreadful state of the prisons, and the atrocity of the jailers, who performed the office of evil spirits, first tempting and then torturing the poor wretches consigned to them. The national depravity, which awoke the snarling muse of many a satirist, seems partly to have arisen from the misapplied eloquence of the preachers, who wasted the time, which ought to have been devoted to better purposes, in sectarian railings, and the flock went away in an ungodly state of satisfaction at hearing the sins of their neighbors analyzed instead of their own, or ready to despise all religion and its professors. Domestic warfare was actively pursued against all who had anything to lose, on every road and avenue leading to the metropolis, by the banditti called highwaymen and footpads, the highwaymen being the cavalry of these marauding forces, the footpads the infantry, the first belonging to the profligate of the middle classes, and even of the upper classes, the last to the desperate from among the poor, and the police, such as it was, organized and regulated the movements of the thieves against the true men. Ghastly avenues, not only of one triple tree, but of rows of them, each garnished with evil fruit, appalled the traveller on entering the principal streets of the capital of Great Britain. Not long after the reign of Anne, a great reward was offered by government to discover the delinquents who had audaciously cut down all the gibbets in the Edgware Road, with their garniture of human relics, low in the dust. Let the frequenters of that busy market street for the new northwestern suburb meditate on the facts implied by the words, all the gibbets in the Edgware Road. The Queen herself had had practical experience of the audacity of the thievish portion of her subjects. She had, when princess, been robbed on the highway after her sister took away her guards, and her London robbers had given her an early specimen of their ability in their vocation by walking off with her coronation plate. If perpetual executions could have induced her people to be honest, there were hecatombs slaughtered every hanging day, which regularly occurred at the end of 6 weeks, when the Queen had to sign death warrants sufficient to have unsettled the reason of most women. There is no regular historical record giving Queen Anne credit for the feelings she really testified on these frightful occasions, nor of her incessant remonstrances when pressed to sign death warrants for desertion from army or navy. Yet the letters she wrote on such occasions rise up in evidence in her behalf as a truly humane sovereign. These little billets, addressed in an evidently unpremeditated style to her secretary, give some insight of the mind of Anne the Queen. Queen Anne to Sir Charles Hedges, Tuesday evening. The enclosed petitions were given me as I came from St. James's. One is, I believe, from the man you gave me an account of yesterday. The other, having a wife and 6 children, makes me think it is a case of compassion. However, I desire you would inform yourself about it as soon as you can possible, and if you find it so, take care his life may be spared. I am your very affectionate friend, Anne R. Wednesday night. I have nothing to say to the execution that is to be on Friday, and am very glad the lords have respite in way, for though the law does not allow that benefit more than once, it would be a barbarous thing to hang a woman when she is with child. I am your affectionate friend, Anne R. Wednesday morning. I have been so pressed again this morning by the woman that gave me the enclosed petition to respite the execution of Jeffreys that I cannot help writing this, to desire you to order a reprieve till Friday, that there may be time to inquire into what this woman says. I am your very affectionate friend, Anne R. It appears that ameliorating the condition of those sentenced to death was one of Anne's favorite private charities, and for this purpose her agents were sent anonymously from her palace. But what can the humanity of a limited sovereign effect against the cruelty and neglect of a representative government, corrupt as that which misruled Great Britain in her era? Although the Queen had been prevented from making Swift a bishop, she offered no opposition to giving him the deanery of St. Patrick, a preferment equally ineligible with that of the bishopric of Hereford, for a man whose Christianity was doubted. The Queen's proceedings in this matter were noted by the clerical candidate in his journal, April 10, 1712. Lord Bolingbroke made me dine with him. He told me the Queen would determine something for me tonight, Windsor or St. Patrick. A few days afterwards he says, "The Duke of Ormond has been today with the Queen, and she was content that Dr. Sterne, who was Dean of St. Patrick, should be Bishop of Dromore, and I Dean of St. Patrick. Then came Lord Treasurer, and said he would not be satisfied without I was prebendary of Windsor." The Queen opposed this arrangement. It may be supposed that she did not wish the author of the Windsor prophecy to be quite so near her and her mistress of the robes when she was enjoying the summer recess at her royal castle. The final settlement of this remarkable presentation took place before the end of April 1713. The whole transaction shows the Queen in the full exercise of her functions as head of the Church. "I was," says Swift, "this noon at Lady Masham's, who was just come from Kensington, where the Queen was. She said much to me of what she had talked to the Queen about me. The poor lady," that is Masham, "fell a shedding tears openly. She could not bear to think of my having St. Patrick and leaving England. You know that deanery is in the Duke of Ormond's gift, but this is concerted between the Queen, Lord Treasurer, and the Duke of Ormond, to make way for me." April 23rd. "This night the Queen has signed all the warrants, and the Duke of Ormond is to send over the order for making me Dean of St. Patrick." Many causes of jealousy in the course of the year of 1713 arose and occasioned irritation in the Queen's mind against her brother. Her remorse concerning him only took place by fits and starts. It was the business of her life to guard those feelings carefully in her own bosom, or only to discuss them in the restless solitude of her nights with Lady Masham, who slept on the ground on a mattress near her Majesty's bed. Her demeanour by day was very different. If ever then she mentioned the Chevalier, it was much in the style which her uncle, Clarendon, recorded with such bitterness, when she joined with her women in mockery of her unfortunate father. It is true such phase of conduct did not last long in her latter days, and after circumstances proved that she only tampered with her feelings and conscience. Yet the following was the result of the close inquiry of a contemporary who professed to be anxiously curious on the subject. Whoever knew anything of the Queen's disposition must believe she had no inclination at all in favour of the Pretender. She was highly and publicly displeased with my Lord Bolingbroke, because he was seen under the same roof with that person at the opera when his lordship was dispatched to France upon difficulties in the way of peace. Her Majesty said, probably at council, that he ought immediately to have withdrawn on the appearance of the other at the opera. Wherein, to speak with freedom, adds Swift, Her Majesty's judgment was not a little mistaken. At her toilet, he pursues, among her women, when mention happened to be made of the Chevalier, the Queen would frequently let fall expressions of such a nature as made it manifest how little she deserved reproaches of too much partiality to him. Indeed, she not unfrequently expressed contempt for the person and concerns of the Chevalier, her brother. The Duchess of Somerset was the person whom the Queen sought to propitiate or please by such expressions. The Queen, at the period of the peace, talked much of Queen Elizabeth. She had adopted her motto, the far-famed Semper Eadem, which Her Majesty rather paraded at this particular time. A lady, wishing to know what those Latin words were in English, asked Swift, who replied, Semper Eadem meant, in Queen Anne's case, worse and worse. It is possible that the political dean meant in health, for he gives ominous hints concerning Her Majesty's constitution at this period. The Queen growing every day more unwieldy, and the gout and other disorders increasing on her, so that whosoever was about the court for the 2 last years of her reign might boldly have fixed the period of her life to a very few months, without pretending to prophecy. She left all her exercise whatsoever, insomuch that, like Henry VIII, during her stay at Windsor Castle, in the decline of the year 1713, she was, to spare herself the trouble of ascending and descending stairs, lowered from the ceiling of one room into another by the means of a chair fitted up with pulleys and tackling. It is probable that the apparatus and contrivances still remained at Windsor Castle which had been used for the Queen's enormous predecessor. So early in 1713 as July, a report of Queen Anne's death had been prevalent in Paris, when it was named by the nuns of Chaillot to marry Beatrice, the widow of James II. She said, "It is untrue, and that the Princess of Denmark," as she called her royal stepdaughter, "had not been more seriously indisposed than usual, although it was certain she had swollen to so enormous a degree of corpulency that she had not been able to walk a step since the preceding November, and that she had heard that Anne was obliged to be lifted into her coach by a machine that had been constructed for that purpose." In the midst of alarms which were very general in England concerning the arrival of the Pretender at Bar-le-Duc, the Duke of Lorraine sent a courteous message to the Queen by his envoy, the Baron de Fortsner. He begged to know what her ideas were concerning his reception of the young Chevalier St. George, as her wishes should be his guide in the whole transaction. The Queen's declining health and meditations on the past had, at that juncture, caused her to experience one of her transitions of mind to warmth and kindliness towards her hapless brother. Her reply was, November 1713. That the more kindness the court of Lorraine showed to the Chevalier St. George, the more her Britannic Majesty would consider herself beholden. Although a very haughty public letter had been just sent in the Queen's name, November 6, 1713, remonstrating with France that the Duke of Lorraine should give protection to a young man disputing her Britannic Majesty's title, and enclosing the addresses of Parliament on the subject, only 4 days afterwards, the soft kind whispers of a private letter from St. John to Prior added, "This letter will be delivered to you by the Baron de Fortsner, who has been twice at the court of our Queen, with the character of envoy from the Duke of Lorraine, who is extremely well with our friends on this side of the water." Her Majesty actually, on the 23rd of December, 1713, signed a warrant addressed to Harley, Earl of Oxford, her Lord Treasurer, setting forth that her late royal father had made Lawrence, Earl of Rochester, Sidney Lord Godolphin, etc., trustees for a yearly annuity for the life of his royal consort, now Mary Beatrice, Queen Dowager. Of the vast arrear of which the unfortunate widow of James II had been deprived, Queen Anne directed an installment to be paid to her by Prior. Anne meant, probably, to liquidate this debt, directions being added that certain sums of the annuity and arrear were to be liquidated quarterly. "During the life of the said Queen Dowager, and for so doing this shall be your warrant, given at our court at Windsor, the 23rd day of December, 1713, in the 12th year of our reign." Another sum, being a quarter's payment of her annuity, it was asserted by the English ministers, was paid to Anne's unfortunate stepmother, but it probably never reached her hands. Scarcely was the Queen's assent given to the commencement of the payment of the dower of her stepmother when she was stricken down with illness of the most threatening character. Some circumstances attended this attack, which caused another change in her Majesty's manner of speaking in regard to her brother. All those who knew her intimately dated an alteration in her feelings from this fit of illness, which occurred Christmas 1713. The Queen was, moreover, made only too well acquainted with the exultant manner in which the opposition meant to hail her demise, for her death was strongly reported, and some time elapsed before it could be credited in London that the Queen was alive and likely to recover. Her enemies had plucked off their masks entirely, and they were perplexed how to fit them on again. Expressions of joy were frequent and loud among the Whig party. Crowded meetings took place, with great hurryings of coaches and chairs to the Earl of Wharton's house. Messengers were dispatched from Windsor with accounts of the Queen's health to the Lord Treasurer, who was then in town. To stop the reports of the Queen's death, he sauntered about the whole of the day and abstained from going to Windsor until his usual time. From his reply to the official report of Dr. Arbuthnot, the Queen's domestic physician, may be gathered how near unto death was the sovereign at this juncture. The Earl of Oxford to Dr. Arbuthnot. I return you very many thanks for the exact and particular account you were pleased to give me of Her Majesty's indisposition. It is of too great importance to all the world not to have a concern for it, and it is my duty to sacrifice everything I am or have to her service. I verily believe that the rigor and trembling you mention may be the effect of a sudden cold the Queen took, for those shiverings are not unusual on the like occasions, and the east wind makes the cold much more affecting the nerves. I have sent my servant with one of your letters, and my chairman with another. Neither of the doctors were at home. It is likely they may be vain enough to publish it, though I trust in God the Queen will be well before they come down. Yet I think you nor I could have been justified unless they had been sent too. God, who has so often saved the Queen and delivered the nation, will, I hope, restore the Queen to perfect health, in which prayer none joins more fervently than your most faithful and most humble servant. Oxford. P.S. There is a meeting appointed tomorrow of the Lords, and should I go down, it would cause great alarm. But I sent this messenger belonging to the Treasury, and desire you will dispatch him quickly back. If there may be any occasion, it can come after we return tomorrow. Endorsed in a more modern hand. Dr. Arbuthnot. When the cautious policy of the Premier permitted him to go down to Windsor, he found the immediate danger of death had passed from Her Majesty. Yet serious alarm sat on every countenance, and the account of the confusion and distraction that was around the Queen was almost incredible. Lord Treasurer Oxford, when giving this detail to Swift, used these remarkable words. Whenever anything ails the Queen, these people are scared out of their wits, and yet they are so thoughtless that as soon as she is well, they act as if she were immortal. His auditor remembered these words, and declared that he thought that the Prime Minister might apply some share of the same blame to himself. The Queen's friend or favourite, the Duchess of Somerset, by command, received due information of the state of Her Majesty from Dr. Arbuthnot, and thus expressed her feelings on the occasion. The Duchess of Somerset to Dr. Arbuthnot. Petworth, 9 o'clock, Friday morning. It is with the greatest concern imaginable that I received your letter this morning with an account of the Queen's being ill, and if it were possible for me to reach Windsor this night, I would certainly do it. But as the roads are now, and no relays of horses at Guildford, I am afraid I shall not be able to go any farther this day, but will set out from thence tomorrow morning very early, and I hope in God I shall find the Queen free from any complaint, and in so good a way of recovery that she will very soon be restored to perfect health. I desire the favor of you to present my most humble duty to her, and to assure her I will make all the haste I can to wait on her, for I shall not stay one moment longer here than till my coach is ready, for I am impatient to have the honor of attending on Her Majesty. I am your humble servant, E. Somerset. I had so ill an opinion of the Queen's health that I was confident you had not a quarter of time for the work you had to do, writes Swift. Having let slip the opportunity of cultivating those dispositions she had got after her sickness at Windsor. What disposition the royal mind was in at this time can only be matter of surmise, perhaps repentance for the past, and fruitless wishes for that species of reparation which was not in her power. Her feelings of this kind were as implied above. It was, moreover, observed that Her Majesty became, during her recovery, pensive and low-spirited, wept frequently, and spent 4 hours every day by herself in the retirement of her closet at Windsor, either in earnest prayer or in writing. What the Queen wrote has not come to light. Her Majesty had returned from Windsor to Kensington by May 18th, and from thence went to St. James's to transact business. Swift notes in his letters, "She can walk, thank God, and is well recovered." The Queen's want of moderation in eating made her relapses very frequent. For instance, after being in danger with gout in the head or stomach on Friday, she would, on the Sunday afterwards, devour a whole fowl, and if this was the repast of a patient scarcely convalescent, it may be supposed that her usual meals were too ample for a female who took no exercise and performed no labor. A French authority declares that the queen's epicurism led her to hold regular councils with her cooks on affairs of the table. But devouring large quantities of food was this queen's propensity, rather than a dainty discrimination regarding its quality. Queen Anne's perpetual vacillations between her dread lest her brother should land in England and her terror lest George of Hanover or his eldest son should come to her court to claim place as her heir and successor produced many inconsistent acts which puzzle historians into silence and wholly prevent her biographer from attributing to her any premeditated principle of action. Her intentions, like feathers on a stream, fled from side to side before every gale that blew. The angry parties into which her empire was rent continued to threaten her with the advent of either the one or other object of her alarm as they became offended with her proceedings. Her Majesty's apprehensions rose high enough in the spring of 1714 to make an appeal to the honourable feelings of her kindred in Hanover. Notwithstanding every temptation from crowds of sycophants who perfectly besieged the court of Hanover in hopes of being remembered when they came to their inheritance, those princes never attempted to encourage faction by approaching the shores of England. Much has been said of their intentions, but the plain fact of their absence, until invited, must outbalance many folios of mere words. The following is the remonstrance which the harassed Queen of Great Britain, the day after her return from Windsor, addressed to her aged kinswoman. Queen Anne to the Princess Sophia, Dowager Electress of Brunswick, May 19, 1714. Madam, Sister, Aunt, since the right of succession to my kingdom has been declared to belong to you and your family, there have always been disaffected persons who, by particular views of their own interest, have entered into measures to fix a prince of your blood in my dominions, even whilst I am yet living. I never thought till now that this project would have gone so far as to have made the least impression on your mind. But, as I have lately perceived by public rumours, which are industriously spread, that your Electoral Highness is come into this sentiment, it is important, with respect to the succession of your family, that I should tell you that such a proceeding will infallibly draw along with it some consequences that will be dangerous to the succession itself, which is not secure any other ways than as the prince, who actually wears the crown, maintains her authority and prerogative. There are here, such is our misfortune, a great many people that are seditiously disposed, so I leave you to judge what tumults they may be able to raise, if they should have a pretext to begin a commotion. I persuade myself, therefore, you will never consent that the least thing should be done that may disturb the repose of me or my subjects. Open yourself with the same freedom that I do to you, and propose whatever you think may contribute to the security of the succession. I will come into it with zeal, provided that it do not derogate from my dignity, which I am resolved to maintain. I am, with a great deal of affection, etc. St. James's, May 19, 1714. Superscribed, to my sister and aunt, Electress Dowager of Brunswick and Lunenburg. The grandson of the Electress, afterwards George II, received from Queen Anne at the same time this epistle. Queen Anne to George Augustus, the Duke of Cambridge, anno 1714. Cousin, an accident which has happened in my Lord Paget's family, having hindered him from setting forward so soon as he thought to have done, I cannot defer any longer letting you know my thoughts with respect to the design you have of coming into my kingdoms, as the opening of the matter ought to have been just to me, so I expected you would not have given ear to it without knowing my thoughts about it. However, this is what I owe to my own dignity, the friendship I have for you, and the electoral house to which you belong, and the true desire I have that it may succeed to my kingdoms. And this requires of me that I should tell you nothing can be more dangerous to the tranquillity of my dominions and the right of succession in your line, and consequently more disagreeable to me than such a proceeding at this juncture. I am, with a great deal of friendship, your very affectionate cousin. Superscribed to the Duke of Cambridge. The patronage Queen Anne bestowed on Tom du Fry, the songwriter of her era, resembled that extended by the sister queens, Mary and Elizabeth, to their dramatic buffoons, Heywood and Tarleton. After Her Majesty's 3 o'clock dinner, du Fry took his stand by the sideboard at the time of dessert to repeat political jibes or doggerel ballads, prepared to flatter some of the well-known prejudices of his royal mistress. It is said that du Fry received a fee of £50 for a stave which he compounded soon after Queen Anne's refusal to invite the Elector of Hanover's son, for the purpose of taking his place as Duke of Cambridge in the House of Peers. It is added that the Electress Sophia greatly displeased and irritated Queen Anne by uttering a speech which was reported. It was, that she cared not when she died, if on her tomb could be recorded that she was Queen of Great Britain and Ireland. Such report pointed the sting of a satirical doggerel, so bountifully rewarded by Queen Anne. The crown's far too weighty for shoulders of 80. She could not maintain such a trophy. Her hand, too, already has grown so unsteady. She can't hold a scepter, so Providence kept her away. Poor old Dowager Sophie. The audiences Queen Anne granted to the facetious du Fry must have taken place in some intervals between the meditative and prayerful change of feelings which had taken place in the mind of Her Majesty during her convalescence in the spring, for the foregoing strain has no savor of edification in it. Many vague reports of secret interviews between Queen Anne and her disinherited brother float through the history of the times. They chiefly arise from the reminiscences of Horace Walpole, who had certainly the best means of knowing the truth if he chose to tell it, a point which is extremely doubtful. He declares that the young prince came incognito to England and was introduced to his sister in her closet by Harley and Lady Masham at the time when the faithful Commons were thanked by the Queen in one of her speeches for putting a price on his head. But Harley could not have been a party concerned, for he was no more sincere in his Jacobitism than Marlborough himself. Lady Masham was a disinterested partisan, but neither herself nor her royal mistress had power enough either to effect an interview of such importance or to keep it from the knowledge of persons interested in the exclusion of the exiled Stuarts. It is affirmed that Queen Anne consulted a bishop who had assumed the mantle of prophecy as to what could be the consequence if she invited her brother and presented him to the Privy Council, as the letters she received from his partisans boldly pressed her to do. "Madam," replied the bishop, "you would be in the Tower in 1 month and dead in 3. Another edition of this anecdote affirms that Anne cherished the idea of resigning her throne to her brother, but no one who has watched her through all the fluctuations of conduct and character will for one moment doubt that ambition and love of her own consequence were governing traits of her disposition to the last. The Anne of history, embellished with so many soft and kindly qualities, might have done so, but the Anne who wrote the scandalous series of letters to her sister was not likely to take any such step. Can we believe that the presence of a brother she had so deeply and wilfully injured must have been a torture to her? The exclusion from the British throne was the slightest part of the wrongs of the young prince. That measure ought to have been majestically founded on the inconsistency of his religion with the royal functions, not meanly on the calumny regarding his birth, for if he were disposed to continue the sacrifice of earthly grandeur to his religious prejudices, why might he not have been permitted to enjoy in his retirement the harmless satisfaction of being a gentleman of unsullied pedigree? Although the slanders on the birth of the son of James II assuredly originated in the plotting brain of Sarah of Marlborough, it is a curious fact that she never names the expatriated heir excepting by the title of the Prince of Wales. Her private letters from Antwerp repeatedly mention him as such when discussing her hopes and fears relative to the restoration of the House of Stuart or the confirmation of the election of the House of Brunswick. "As soon as the Emperor is forced into peace," she says, "the Prince of Wales is to come into England, and 'tis said in France that Queen Anne will consent to it. Perhaps she is not yet acquainted with that part of it. But, however, when things are prepared for it, there can be no great difficulty in that, nor no great matter whether the queen likes it or not. A tolerably good proof is here that Queen Anne had never seen her brother, or intended it if she could help it, for though the most lively hatred subsisted between her and her once loved favourite, yet the latter knew well every turn and feeling in the mind of her mistress, and doubts are here expressed as to whether the queen would like the restoration of her brother. "I never," writes the Duchess, "was much concerned for the disappointment of the honest people," that is, the Jacobites. Concerning the words in this proclamation, if the Prince of Wales landed, it appears to me that the great struggle the ministers made to have that matter left to her Majesty's own time, and then the Queen answering, that she did not think it necessary, must needs help to convince men, that whenever the Prince does really land, whatever are the proclamations on either side, those that conquer will do as they please. About this time, great dissensions arose between the Queen and the Earl of Oxford, which were clearly attributable to Lady Masham, who had discovered that her cousin did not mean to aid in the restoration of the Queen's brother. As the founder of the South Sea Fund, which James Stuart would not guarantee, the Premier was perforce his opponent. End of section 27. Section 28 of the Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 12, by Agnes and Elisabeth Strickland. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Anne, Chapter 12, Part 1. One day, in the middle of June, 1714, when the council met, the Queen, giving nobody time to speak, told them she had resolved on a proclamation which she caused to be read, and then, without asking or hearing advice from anyone, she went out. Thus she made it entirely her own act. The proclamation was carried into effect June 23rd, setting a price of £5,000. For the apprehension of the pretender, dead or alive, if he were found in Great Britain or Ireland. Both Oxford and Bolingbroke professed utter ignorance of it, and intense astonishment withal, at her Majesty's manner of bringing it to pass. They declared it to be a measure that emanated entirely from Queen Anne. Even those who record the Queen's conduct fancied that there was something mysterious in the whole, and that, in spite of all appearances, it was against her Majesty's real inclinations. Very limited is the knowledge of human nature shown by those who argue thus. Double-minded the Queen had been from her youth upwards, and divine wisdom has pronounced that such persons are unstable in all their ways. It was her punishment to feel the fierce conflicts of terror and remorse which deprived her of all decision in her action. The course that conscience dictated to her imperatively one day was crossed by her fears the next. Thus did Anne wear out the short remnant of her existence in the convulsive throes of self-contradiction, at times which were very fresh in the memories of those who saw her set a price on her brother's life. When any injurious measure had been debated against him in council, the Queen had been known to burst into tears, and then the assembly broke up in the utmost confusion. The Queen had probably made a private compromise with the Whigs that if they did not insist on bringing the heir of Hanover to England, she would proscribe her brother. On the other side, it is said that, on a former occasion, she appeared horror-stricken when the profligate Earl of Wharton proposed to add to the mention of the reward for the apprehension of the pretender the homicidal words, "whether he be dead or alive." These instances illustrate the state of pitiable indecision that agonized the mind of the declining Queen. Let not the perpetual tissue of contradictions, which these pages must present, regarding the conduct of Queen Anne, raise doubts of the authenticity of the actions detailed. Such contradictions are the natural results of a will and conscience suffering internal war. The conscience of the Queen, doubtless, was fully convicted of all her trespasses against her father, his wife, and her unoffending brother. On the other side, must not the same conscience have addressed to her awful whispers of such truths as these? Wretch, you have urged the religion of your country as the excuse for all these slanders, this deceit, and for the bloodshed that has been the result. Yet will you, when your turn of personal aggrandizement is served, and your dying hand can grasp the scepter no more, deliver it to a Roman Catholic, who, being such, can have no will of his own in religious government? Wherefore then was your father, the great colonizing, naval, and financial king, driven forth, scathed with your slanders respecting the birth of his boy? Why did you not suffer him to remain and leave the scepter to his heir, unencumbered with millions of debt, and unstained with the blood of thousands of his subjects, who, instead of being slaughtered on the scaffolds of your sister, or in useless continental wars, would have extended his colonies, and cultivated commerce and the arts of peace? Let your country, at least, retain what she has bought at such cost, namely, all the privileges of her established church, which the Revolution has left her? Who can doubt that the meditations of Queen Anne were according to this tenor, and who can blame her that she ultimately acted in obedience to them? Yet the natural yearnings of her heart forced her into many contradictory proceedings in favor of her brother, being occasionally swayed in his behalf by those officials who were immediately about her person, as Masham and Arbuthnot, his warm though humble friends. Sophia, Electress of Hanover, died on the birthday of the Chevalier, June 10, 1714. The ambitious words attributed to this princess are inconsistent, it must be owned, with the extreme moderation and justice of her character, she being at that time 84, and Queen Anne but 50. Some of the friends of the Electress declare that she had died a few minutes after reading Queen Anne's angry letter. The foregoing epistle, dated May 19th, is quoted as the death blow of the Electress, but that illustrious lady had experienced too many changes of capricious fortune in her youth to be slain with a few diplomatic words. Scarcely had the Jacobite party recovered from the consternation that the queen's proscription of her exiled brother had induced, when a new turn of her humour amazed all people. The Earl of Mar, who had fought bravely in the Marlborough Continental Wars, was presented to the queen on his marriage with Lady Frances Pierrepont, sister to the famous lady Mary Wortley Montagu. The queen distinguished this noble very graciously, and he was soon on terms of very confidential intercourse with her majesty, and appointed one of her ministers of state. Lord Mar, it will be remembered, was afterwards the leader of the Jacobite insurrection of 1715. A particular circumstance proved that he and Queen Anne discussed Jacobite politics in their conferences. The Whigs had made a symbol to designate their party, similar to the white harts of Richard II, the swans of the son of Henry VI, or the white and red roses of York and Lancaster. The Whig badge was a miniature brass fusee, about 2 inches in length, which was worn at the waistcoat breast, but some were in gold, some in silver, according to the rank of the partisan. A friend of mine being let into the secret, acquainted me thereof, and brought me 3, says Lockhart, one of which was given to the queen by Lord Mar. But her majesty seemed to wish to ascertain precisely whether the Whig party would own and respond to this symbol. For this purpose, Lockhart and Mar agreed upon a scheme which was forthwith communicated to her majesty. Lockhart tied the little fusee or fusel with a ribbon to his buttonhole, and walked into the House of Commons and took his seat by Sir Robert Pollock, a staunch West Country Whig member. Presently, Lockhart manoeuvred the Whig badge so that his fellow senator took a full view of it. Sir Robert Pollock was, although of different politics, Lockhart's near kinsman and personal friend. He eyed the party symbol with no little consternation, and his cousin took a mischievous pleasure in coquetting with this toy. When Lockhart looked at it, he affected to conceal it, till at last the Whig member asked him angrily, what the devil he meant, and whether he were in jest or earnest? Lockhart pretended not to know what he was talking about. Pollock then asked, if he was come over to them? You have no reason to doubt, said the Jacobite member, seeing I carry the mark of the beast. Well, replied Sir Robert Pollock, I do not know what to make of you, but either our secrets are discovered, or you are a convert. Lockhart answered, that he had not hid it yet, he would leave him to guess which was the case. But afterwards Sir Robert Pollock never saw him without urging him to tell him how he had got that toy, for he had reason to believe these badges would not have fallen into such hands. In discoursing with him, continues Lockhart, at divers times on the subject, I found the account I had of its being designed as a mark of faction was very well grounded. He supposes that it was connected with some insurrectionary rising likely to be attended with extensive slaughter, as he communicated this supposition, the dying queen, marking its connection with the knightly deeds of the furious Mohawk Club, and that named from its reputable components, the Hellfire Club. Her vacillations were not likely to be settled into any decided course of action against a party whose intentions were of this ferocious nature. The former badge of the Orange Party was a little pewter warming pan, such as are occasionally sold at country fairs for the cost of a farthing. While the whole country was dreading or hoping that the Queen would take some decided step for the restoration of her brother, all the Tories being then deemed Jacobites, these Tories joined the Whigs, and by majorities in the House of Commons proceeded to reiterate the Queen's personal orders in council by setting a price on the head of James Stuart, talking at the same time of inviting the hereditary Prince of Hanover over to England as the first peer of the blood royal, to take his seat as Duke of Cambridge. Exasperated at these proceedings, the real Jacobite party in the House of Commons, which amounted to about a third, formed themselves into what was called, in the diplomatic language of the day, a squadron volante. And as they could not command a majority, they came to a resolution to join with any party so as to outvote the ministry and stop the wheels of government. This is not an uncommon maneuver at the present day, and a dissolution of Parliament is usually the remedy, a measure that would, at the crisis of the Queen's demise, have proved very advantageous for the Jacobites, because there would have been no responsible head of government, and party spirit, becoming terrific during the election of new members of Parliament, would have flamed out into a civil war. The clue of the intrigues of this important epoch is furnished by the head of the Jacobite Squadron Volante, the then member for Edinburgh, Lockhart of Carnwath. This member's historical narrative of the scenes in which he was a principal actor presents the only intelligible narrative we ever met with of this extraordinary juncture. He speaks in many instances with the vivacity natural to a party concerned. About 10 days after the Jacobites had outvoted the ministry, says Lockhart of Carnwath, the Lord Bolingbroke sent for me very early one morning, and I no sooner entered his room than he asked me, with an abjuration, what moved me and so many honest gentlemen, that is the Jacobites, to act so unaccountable a part? I answered, that if his lordship and his friends would give a tolerable reason for their conduct of late, we could do the like, I believed. He said, what had passed was unavoidable in the present state of affairs, and was, moreover, to be attributed to Lord Oxford, but his business was done, and he would soon be laid aside. But it was not advisable to turn him out and his partisans while the present Parliament sat, for his lordship would join the Whigs and make a terrible bustle and clamour in Parliament, whereas, if Parliament was prorogued, there was no power to thwart or interfere with the Queen, who would be at liberty to do what she pleased. Bolingbroke then threw out many hints that the restoration of her brother was the first wish of the Queen's heart, which would be thwarted if Lockhart, Shippen, Packington, and other leaders of the Squadron Volante in the House of Commons stopped the wheels of state business. Is it not, continued the orator Bolingbroke, better to take my word and follow my advice at once, than run the risk of baffling the Queen's designs, when it is a certain truth that they are such as will be agreeable to you? The Queen, meantime, witnessing privately the discussions in Parliament, and by her presence, apparently, formed some barrier to the furious effervescence of party hate. Yesterday they were all in flame in the House of Lords about the Queen's answer, till Her Majesty came in and put an end to it. History has not noted this custom of the monarchs of the 17th century. Charles II often witnessed, as a private individual, the debates in Parliament. He said they were entertaining as any comedy. William III spent much of his time there. His entrances were always noted in the manuscript journals of the House of Lords. Queen Anne almost lived in the House of Lords while it sat in session. She witnessed a debate within 3 weeks of her mortal attack. Her Majesty came in the hopes that her presence might induce them to keep the peace. Once, however, it happened that the name of the disinherited prince, her brother, was introduced by one of the Jacobite members into his speech, on which a stormy discussion took place. Order, etiquette, and even decency were forgotten by some of the speakers, and observations so pointed and personal were made that Her Majesty, perceiving all eyes were turned on her box, became painfully embarrassed, and hastily drew the curtains with her own royal hand to conceal her confusion. Her father's widow, Mary Beatrice, related this incident. In a few days, pursues Lockhart, the money bills and other affairs of moment being dispatched, the Parliament was prorogued, on which occasion the Queen came to the House looking extremely well, and spoke to both Houses more briskly and resolute than on other the like occasions, acquainting them that she was determined to call them together before it was long. Her Majesty came in state, July 7, 1714, to the House of Lords. How she looked and appeared, an eyewitness, Lockhart, who was a member for Edinburgh, has recorded. And it must be remembered that the Queen's maladies proceeded from plethora, aggravated by habits which render such tendencies fatal to those who enjoy their ease overmuch. The Queen had too much to drink, too much to eat, too little to do, and these causes colored her complexion with a semblance of health and strength far more dangerous than the wan hue of less perilous disease. Hence the mistaken report of "good Queen Anne's good looks," as recorded by her historian senator, Lockhart of Carnwath. The Queen, in her accustomed thrilling sweetness of voice, thanked her assembled peers and commons for the supplies they had given her for the current year, and for discharging the national debts. She added, that her chief concern was to preserve to them and to their posterity their holy religion, the liberty of her subjects, and to secure the present and future tranquillity of her kingdoms. But these desirable ends could never be obtained unless all groundless jealousies were laid aside, and unless they paid the same regard for her just prerogative which she had always showed for the rights of her people. Her Majesty then prorogued her Parliament until the 10th of August, a day she never saw. Lockhart pursues. About an hour after this, I met General Stanhope, walking all alone and very humdrum, in Westminster Hall. I asked him, what was the matter with him, for he seemed to be out of humour when everybody was rejoiced at being able to get into the country. He answered, that all true Britons had reason to be out of humour. I replied, that I thought myself a Briton true, and yet was in a very good humour. Why, said he, then it seems you have not considered the Queen's speech? Yes, I have, replied Lockhart, and I was pleased with it, for I think she spoke like herself. That's true enough, said Stanhope, for from what she said, I consider our liberties as gone. I wish with all my soul it were so, retorted Lockhart. How? Exclaimed Stanhope. Do you declare openly for your pretender? The pretender? Said Lockhart. I was not thinking of him, but as you Englishmen have made slaves of us Scots, I would, or should, be glad to see ye reduced to the same state, which would make our union more complete and equal. Well, well, cried Stanhope, 'tis no jest. You'll get your pretender, and you'll repent it, I answer, ere long. And with that the gentleman went off in a prodigious fury. It must have been her mention of prerogative that incensed the Whig general Stanhope and exhilarated Lockhart, but the great error of the speech was the false phrase put in the helpless Queen's mouth, that her Parliament had discharged the national debts, when in truth she, in that session, had greatly enlarged them. The Queen had, it was supposed, dissolved Parliament so unusually early as the 7th of July, old style, in order to prevent any discussions on the arrival of the Baron de Bothmar, who was expected from Hanover to announce the death of the Electress Sophia at her palace of Herrenhausen the preceding 8th of June. German statesmen are proverbially as slow as those of Spain, and it appears that Bothmar did not arrive with his credentials until July 25th. The general mourning was, as a matter of course, ordered for Her Majesty's illustrious kinswoman, and herself complying with the injunction that had been issued in her name, for all people to put on suitable mourning. The substitution of the elector's name in the common prayer book in the place of that of his mother as heir presumptive to the throne of Great Britain caused her great agitation. The displacing of Harley, Earl of Oxford, from his dignity as Lord Treasurer appears to have been coincident with the resolution of the Jacobite party just described by its leader in the House of Commons, Lockhart of Carnwath. But the Queen and her household found that no insult could induce him to quit his office. The dragon holds the little machine, that is the treasurer's white staff, with a dead gripe, wrote Arbuthnot. I would no more have suffered what he has done than I would have sold myself to the galleys. Lady Masham huffed her cousin whenever he dined with her, which he usually did, and in company with her enemy, St. John, Lord Bolingbroke, not as her guest, but at the board of green cloth. On one of these occasions, she taunted him by saying, "You never did the Queen any service, nor are you capable of doing her any." This was as late as July 14th, when it was found that nothing could induce the dragon, as they called Lord Oxford, to resign. The Queen, to whom he was personally obnoxious, as he had given her some unknown but mortal offense in his fits of intoxication, imparted to the lords of her cabinet council the following extraordinary list of reasons for dismissing her Lord Treasurer. Some of his delinquencies would have seemed more fitting for the discharge of an ill-conducted footman. Her Majesty affirmed that he neglected all business, was seldom to be understood, that when he did explain himself, she could not depend upon the truth of what he said, that he never came to her at the time she appointed, that he often came drunk. Lastly, to crown all, he behaved to her with bad manners, indecency, indecorum, and disrespect. The stick, or white staff, is still in his hand, because they cannot agree who shall be the new commissioners. We suppose the blow will be given tonight or tomorrow morning. This letter was dated July 27, 1714. It was written by one of Bolingbroke's under-secretaries of state. The blow was indeed given, but it was the death blow to the Queen. Her Majesty was then at Kensington Palace, where she always sojourned, and held council when detained to transact business in the middle of the summer. She had, in the preceding June, been better in health than usual. Her spirits had been cheered by passing the Schism Bill, which she deemed would add to the prosperity of the Church, although it was feared by others that the bill would occasion some persecutions against the dissenters. The Queen had visited Windsor in the beginning of July, but having been taken ill there, had returned to Kensington, in hopes of putting an end to the perpetual quarrels between Harley, Lord Treasurer, and Bolingbroke, the Secretary of State, by dismissing the former. The Queen had frequently exclaimed, in the course of the sessions, that the perpetual contention of which her cabinet council was the scene would cause her death. Therefore she determined to bring matters to a crisis on Tuesday, the 27th of July. Her Majesty wrote a note to the Earl of Oxford on the morning of that day, telling him she was willing to receive the resignation of his charge. The Earl ran to speak with the Queen, who was at first denied to him, but he was admitted 2 hours later. He only stayed with Her Majesty 1/4 of an hour. He then went to the Treasury, made his payments and arrangements, and at 8 in the evening of the same day returned to the Queen, into whose hands he finally surrendered his white staff. He remained with her a full half-hour. The adventures of this eventful day had not concluded. On Tuesday night, a cabinet council was held, after the Earl of Oxford had resigned his staff, consequently about 9 o'clock. To consult what persons were to be named in the commission into which the office of Lord Treasurer or Prime Minister was to be put, for every one of the Jacobite party shrank from its sole responsibility. Sir William Wyndham offered to be one of the 5 commissioners. He was just appointed Chancellor of the Exchequer. None of the council could agree as to the other 4 partners. The chief Jacobites in the Queen's Cabinet Council may be reckoned as Lord Harcourt, the Duke of Ormond, and Sir William Wyndham, and the Duke of Buckingham and the Lord Shrewsbury, but the last is doubtful. However this might be, the partisans of the displaced premier kept the invalid queen sitting at council until 2 in the morning, raging at the Jacobite faction in the most frightful manner. The scene was only terminated by the violent agitation of the queen, who complained of the disorder of her head, and finally sank into a deep swoon from utter exhaustion. Nothing was settled, and Her Majesty was carried to bed seriously ill. She wept the livelong night, without once closing her eyes. Another council was called for the 28th of July, with as little success in regard to any settled determination. It was again broken up by the illness of the Queen, and consequently was prorogued until the 29th of July. The Queen declared to her physicians that her indisposition was occasioned by the trouble of mind which the disputes of her ministers gave her, and made use of these words to Dr. Arbuthnot: "I shall never survive it." Her Majesty was observed to be unusually silent and reserved at these two remarkable councils, probably from an utter incapacity for utterance. Lady Masham became apprehensive that her royal mistress was on the verge of an illness far more alarming than any of the numerous attacks through which she had previously nursed her. In alarm, she wrote her perceptions of the Queen's uneasiness of mind and body to Dean Swift, the only politician at that crisis to whom she attributed energy and decision of character. Swift had been about the court the whole summer, soliciting the place of historiographer to the Queen, for the purpose of writing the history of the Peace of Utrecht. Her Majesty or ministers had given the office to the learned Maddox, a person whose heart and soul were buried among the dusty records of the Plantagenets, studies much more convenient than stirring up the yet glowing embers of a ratification which might have been called a cessation from bloodshed rather than a peace. So replete was its very name with the elements of strife, a peculiarity which it retains to this day. The stormy transition from sanguinary warfare to such peace as the Treaty of Utrecht gave was even then rudely shaking the sands of the Queen's precarious existence. July 29th. "I was," said Lady Masham to Swift, "resolved to stay till I could tell you that our Queen had got so far the better of the dragon," that is Harley, Earl of Oxford, "as to take her power out of his hands. He has been the most ungrateful man to her, and to all his best friends, that ever was born. I cannot have much time now to write all my mind, for my dear mistress is not well, and I think may lay her illness to the charge of the Lord Treasurer, who for 3 weeks together was vexing and teasing her without intermission. She could not get rid of him till Tuesday last." That is July 27th. "I must put you in mind of one passage in your letter to me, which is, 'I pray God send you wise and faithful friends to advise with you at this time, when there are so great difficulties to struggle with.' That is very plain and true. Therefore will you, who have gone through so much and taken more pains than anybody and given wise advice, if that wretched man Oxford had had sense and honesty to have taken it, I say, will you leave us and go into Ireland? No, it is impossible. Your charity and compassion for this poor lady," that is the Queen, "who has been barbarously used, will not let you do it. I know you take great delight to help the distressed, and there cannot be a greater object than this good lady, who deserves your pity. Pray, dear friend, stay here, and do not believe us all alike, to throw away good advice, and despise everybody's understanding but one's own. I could say a great deal upon the subject, but I must go to her, for she is not well. This comes to you by a safe hand, so that neither of us need to be in any pain about it." At the very moment when the compassion of one of the mightiest minds in her empire was thus claimed for Queen Anne by her confidential attendant, the destiny thus dreaded for Her Majesty was near at hand. 2 councils having been interrupted by the violent illness of the Queen, the decisive one was delayed until the evening of the 29th of July, Thursday. The anticipation of another agitating and protracted scene of altercation between the unmannerly worldlings who, though they styled themselves her servants, not only violated the respect due to her as their sovereign, but conducted themselves with the most cruel disregard of her feelings as a lady, and her weakness as an invalid, was of course most distressing to the poor sufferer, who was sinking prematurely to the grave beneath the weight of the crown she had sinfully coveted and for her own punishment obtained. Worn out as she was with sickness of mind and body, Anne had not completed her 50th year. When the hour appointed for the royal victim to meet these trusty lords of her council drew near, Mrs. Danvers, the oldest and probably most attached lady of her household, entering the presence chamber of Kensington Palace, saw to her surprise Her Majesty standing before the clock and gazing intently upon it. Mrs. Danvers was alarmed and perplexed by the sight, as Her Majesty was seldom able to move without assistance. She approached and ascertained that it was indeed Queen Anne who stood there. Venturing to interrupt the ominous silence that prevailed through the vast room, only broken by the heavy ticking of the clock, she asked, "Whether Her Majesty saw anything unusual there in the clock?" The Queen answered not, yet turned her eyes to the questioner with so woeful and ghastly a regard that, as this person afterwards affirmed, she saw death in the look. Assistance was summoned by the cries of the terrified attendant, and the Queen was conveyed to her bed, from whence she never rose again. It appears that her dread of a third stormy council had caused her illness. "Her Majesty was taken," says Lamberti, "on the evening of the 29th of July with a burning fever. Her brain was affected, and she murmured all night at intervals words relative to the Pretender without cessation." There can be no doubt that this peculiar bias of the Queen's mind occasioned her illness to be concealed for several hours in the recesses of the royal apartments of her palace at Kensington. Dr. Arbuthnot and Lady Masham dared not make Her Majesty's state sufficiently public as to cause a general consultation of the royal physicians, lest one of them, Dr. Mead, a politician in the Whig interest, should hear the poor Queen uttering "the perilous stuff" that weighed so heavily on her breast. Yet there was a medical consultation held in the middle of that important night by Dr. Arbuthnot and such physicians as were in ordinary attendance on Her Majesty, being Dr. Thomas Lawrence, Dr. Hans Sloane, Dr. Shadwell, and Dr. Sir David Hamilton, the same person whose very remarkable correspondence with the Duchess of Marlborough has been previously quoted. It was agreed that Her Majesty ought to be cupped, which was accordingly done in the presence of Lady Masham and Dr. Arbuthnot, about 2 in the morning of July 30th. 8 ounces of blood, very thick, were taken from her. She was relieved from her worst symptoms, but it was observed that her eyes looked dull and heavy. Severe indications of indigestion occurred. Indeed, the common traditional report that the death of good Queen Anne was occasioned by her eating a vast quantity of black heart cherries was perhaps not altogether unfounded. Towards morning, the Queen fell asleep, and, it is said, rose at her accustomed hour of 7 in the morning, and was attired and combed by her women. But such an alarming relapse occurred at 8:30, that Dr. Arbuthnot was forced to make her malady public, for he could not have recourse to the Lancet without more authority, and he considered the royal patient was suffering under an access of apoplexy. When Mr. Dickens, the Queen's apothecary, had taken 10 ounces of blood from Her Majesty's arm, a sound was heard of someone falling heavily. The Queen was sufficiently recovered to ask what that noise was. Her attendants answered, "It was Lady Masham, who had swooned from grief and exhaustion." It was judged proper to carry Lady Masham for recovery from the royal apartments, and the bustle of removing her, together with the incident itself, was supposed greatly to alarm and flurry the Queen. End of section 28. Section 29 of the Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 12, by Agnes and Elisabeth Strickland. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Anne, Chapter 12, Part 2. Her Majesty experienced a third terrible seizure of pain and weight in the head just before 10 o'clock the same morning, and everyone around her believed that her death would be immediate. There is reason to suppose that the Duchess of Ormond had, in the late violent changes, succeeded to the functions of the Duchess of Somerset, the Queen's principal lady and mistress of the robes. Terrified at the state of her royal mistress, the Duchess of Ormond sent an account of it to her husband, who was then at the cockpit, the official seat of government, endeavouring to arrange the jarring and broken cabinet council, of which he seems to have been president. The news flew like fire over London, and the influential Whig magnates, the Dukes of Somerset and Argyle, forced their way into the assembling Privy Council and insisted on taking their places therein. From that moment they swayed everything, for the displaced Premier, the Earl of Oxford, had sent a private circular to every Whig lord in or near London who had ever belonged to the Privy Council, warning them to come and make a struggle for the Protestant succession. There is no doubt that Oxford had had immediate notice of the Queen's mortal seizure on the preceding evening. Dr. Meade's hopes made him bold in pronouncing the truth. No one about the dying Queen chose to believe him, upon which he demanded that those who were really in favour of the Protestant succession in the royal household should send a memorial of Her Majesty's symptoms to the Elector of Hanover's physicians, who would soon pronounce how long Anne, Queen of Great Britain and Ireland, had to live, but he staked his professional credit that Her Majesty would be no more long before such intelligence could be received. It has always been considered that the prompt boldness of this political physician occasioned the peaceable proclamation of George I. Dr. Meade even ventured to predict the Queen's demise in 1 hour. He was often taunted afterwards with the professional chagrin his countenance expressed when the royal patient, on being again blooded, recovered her speech and senses. Lord Bolingbroke went to her and told her the Privy Council were of opinion it would be for the public service if the Duke of Shrewsbury were made Lord Treasurer. The Queen immediately consented, but the Duke refused to accept the staff unless the Queen herself placed it in his hand. He approached her bed and asked her if she knew to whom she gave the white wand. Yes, the Queen replied, to the Duke of Shrewsbury. History adds that when the dying sovereign placed it in his hands, she added, "For God's sake, use it for the good of my people." A speech perfectly consistent with Anne's conduct as regnant, because whatsoever wrong she practiced before her accession, she was a most beneficent and loving sovereign to her people, who have reason to bless her name to this hour. Queen Anne retained sufficient intelligence to be conscious that the Duke of Shrewsbury, then invested by her act with the power of Prime Minister, in addition to his mighty functions of Lord High Chamberlain and Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, must perforce act according to the parliamentary settlement in favour of her distant kindred, the Princes of Hanover. Having thus performed her duty as queen, all the duties she had outraged in her early career to obtain the crown overwhelmed her conscience and rendered her deathbed comfortless. When her mind wandered, she began to utter in a piteous tone, "Oh, my brother! Oh, my poor brother!" The Bishop of London stood by her bedside, contemplating this awful termination of the successful fruition of ambition. He was the same prelate who had assisted her in giving peace to Europe, and had been advanced to the see of London, on the miserable death of the Queen's former tutor, the aged Henry Compton. The nature of the injunctions given by the dying sovereign to Robinson, Bishop of London, after the long private conference in which she is said, in compliance with the recommendation in the rubric for the visitation of the sick, to have disburthened her mind of the weighty matter that troubled her departing spirit, was surmised from his emphatic rejoinder as he left her bedside. "Madam, I will obey your commands. I will declare your mind, but it will cost me my head." The words were heard by the Duchess of Ormond. At the same time, the Queen said, she would receive the sacrament the next day. Whatsoever was done by the Bishop of London, it is impossible to say, but probability points at the fact that the royal wish was delivered to the Duke of Ormond, the commander of the army. The Queen, when the bishop had withdrawn, fell again into her delirious agony, and she reiterated unceasingly her former exclamations of, "Oh, my brother, my dear brother, what will become of you?" Something within her mind, stronger than delirium, must have whispered that her recently given commands would be useless. Little did the queen anticipate when, as the Princess Anne in 1688, she was eagerly employed in casting the well-known stigma on the birth of her brother, that her deathbed lamentations would be for him, and that her last agonizing cry would be his name. Queen Anne continued to repeat this sad exclamation until speech, sight, and pulse left her. The Privy Council then assembled in the royal bedchamber. They called on the physicians to declare their opinions, who all told them the queen's state was hopeless. They, that is the Privy Council, withdrew, all but the Bishop of London, who remained near the insensible queen. But she never again manifested sufficient consciousness to speak or pray, although she, from time to time, showed signs of actual existence. As the Privy Council separated, the Duke of Buckingham came to the Duke of Ormond, clapped his hand on his shoulder, and said, "My lord, you have 24 hours to do your business in, and make yourself master of the kingdom." The military force being in the hands of Ormond, he knew that the appeal to arms would be as useless as it was criminal. But if any popular movement had coincided with his wishes, there is little doubt regarding which side Ormond would have taken. The Great Seal was put into an important patent by 4 o'clock that day. It was to provide for the government of the country by 24 regents, who constituted an interregnum. The act had been prepared for years, and enclosed in the black bag, which the Duchess of Marlborough exultingly intimates had long been a source of inexpressible horror to Queen Anne, whensoever her thoughts glanced that way. Dr. Radcliffe, who had been, since noon, sent for from Carshalton to attend her majesty, returned for answer in the evening, that he was ill and could not come. The queen's friends were positive that although the poor man was actually in a dying state himself, he could arrest the power of death almost by looking upon the royal patient, for the Lord Gower had often been in the same condition as the queen with the gout in the head, and Radcliffe kept him alive many years. The Privy Council never sent any order to Dr. Radcliffe, nor was his name ever mentioned there, or by the queen herself. It was only Lady Masham who sent privately an agonizing entreaty to summon him. "I am just come from Kensington," writes Charles Ford, an official in the government and a correspondent of Swift, Saturday, July 31st, "where I have spent these 2 days. At present, the queen is alive, and better than could be expected. Her disorder began about 8 or 9 yesterday morning. The doctors ordered her head to be shaved. While it was doing, the queen fell into convulsions, or, as they say, a fit of apoplexy, which lasted 2 hours, during which time she showed but little signs of life." At 6 in the evening of the same day, another anxious watcher within the palace walls, Erasmus Lewis, one of the displaced secretaries, wrote to Swift, "At the time I am writing, the breath is said to be in the queen's nostrils, but that is all. No hopes of her recovery. Lord Oxford is in council, so are the Whigs. We expect the demise tonight. There is every prospect that the Elector of Hanover, that is George I, will meet with no opposition, the French having no fleet nor being able to put one out so soon. Lady Masham received me kindly. Poor woman, I heartily pity her. Dr. Arbuthnot thinks you should come up. A report had been carried into the city during the course of Saturday afternoon that the queen was actually dead, and what was more infamous, stocks rose on it as much as 3%. But that was really no disgrace to the queen's memory. Again the rumor spread that her majesty's danger was over, and that she was fast recovering. She was prayed for in the daily service at St. Paul's Cathedral, but not in her own royal chapel of St. James, and the omission there excited the surprise and anger of her anxious subjects. Dr. Mead, a violent Whig, was, as all the queen's friends declared, chagrined when she seemed to rally and recover as the day advanced, and actually imbibed a little nourishment, although past the power of utterance. The council, which had sat through the preceding day and night, adjourned till 8 next morning, having first dispatched Craggs to Hanover by the Hague, laid embargo on all shipping, and ordered the Hanoverian envoy to attend with the black bag or box, wherein was deposited the authority for the regency in case of the demise of the queen. It has been observed that the displaced minister, Oxford, had at the first alarm of the queen's illness sent round little billets to summon all the Whig lords to the privy council, and when there, he continued to exert himself in favour of the Hanoverian succession. The lords of the council sent to the Lord Mayor to take special care of the city, the trained bands were raised, and a triple guard sent to the Tower. All persons were deeply concerned among the populace at the state of the queen, as was visible by their countenances. Great solicitude was manifested regarding her all the 31st of July, in the swarming and agitated streets. Some reported that she was better, others that she had died at 11. She was again prayed for in St. Paul's Cathedral in the afternoon daily service, but nowhere else. During the hours while the insensible queen was thus suspended over the abyss of eternity, other vigils were held in the recesses of her palace at Kensington, and other councils besides that one, the vigilance of which secured the throne to our present royal line. If the evidence of an enemy may be admitted, the Jacobite members of the queen's household were greatly taken by surprise at the sudden and mortal attack, having shut their eyes to all symptoms of her danger, in strong reliance on a prediction which had given her years of life to come. One of the queen's physicians is charged with these defective conjurations, but Peter Ray leaves his reader's imagination to rove over a formidable medical band without indicating the professor of the black art among them, further than that one of her physicians, the most intimate with her, had pretended, by some other art than physic, whether of calculation, magic, or other infernal speculations, to tell the great men of the royal household that the queen would live 6½ years. This was certainly a reason why they were the more secure, and had not their design complete, and all orders and warrants in readiness for the execution thereof. So says this contemporary, but he comes to a false conclusion, for Anne would never have authorized any such warrants while she believed her existence would last one day. The first alarm of the queen's illness and surprising distemper, continues Peter Ray, brought the whole Jacobite party to court. The great officers, as well as the privy councillors of the other sex, met in a certain lady's apartment. In these apartments, business of the nicest nature in government used to be familiarly discussed. It was found that my Lady Masham was with the queen, whereupon they sent for the countess. This lady had been watching by the queen for some hours, and had retired to take a little rest. She was roused, but entered the Jacobite conclave ill and in tears. She is supposed to be Lady Jersey, the widow of Edward, Earl of Jersey, one of the queen's Tory ministers, who had died just after the Marlborough faction were displaced. Nothing could, however, be done without Lady Masham, who was sent for from the royal chamber. She entered in the utmost disorder, and without staying for any questions, cried out, "Oh, my lords, we are undone, entirely ruined. The queen is a dead woman. All the world cannot save her." Upon which one of the lords asked, "If the queen had her senses, and if Lady Masham thought she could speak to them?" "Impossible," returned Lady Masham. "Her pain deprives her of all sense, and in the intervals she dozes and speaks to nobody." "That is hard indeed," said another of the lords. "Could she but speak to us and give us orders, and sign them, we might do the business for all this." "Alas," said another lord, "who would act on such orders? We are all undone." To whom another replied, "Then, my lord, we cannot be worse. I assure you that if her majesty would give orders to proclaim her successor in her lifetime, I would do it at the head of the army. I'll answer for the soldiers." The Duke of Ormond, commander-in-chief, is clearly indicated by this speech. "Do it, then," said Dr. Atterbury, the Bishop of Rochester. Let us go out and proclaim the Chevalier at Charing Cross. Do you not see that we have no time to lose?" The Countess begged them to waive debate. "For," said she, "there is nothing to be done. Her Majesty is no longer capable of directing anything. She is half dead already. I die for her if she lives 24 hours." The Duke of Ormond returned, "Lord, what an unhappy thing this is! What a cause is here lost at one blow! Is there no remedy?" After some discourse, they sent Lady Masham to see if there was any alteration in the queen. She presently returned and told them, "It is all the same. She is drawing on. She dies upwards. Her feet are cold and dead already." One of the secret conclave then proposed to temporize for the instant, and on the last breath issuing from the queen, to proclaim the Elector of Hanover, whom they would privately do their best to oppose. In the worst, they should all be exonerated by pleading that they were the first and forwardest to proclaim him. The lords appeared stunned at this proposal, but one of them, turning to the Countess, said, "Pray, madam, what is your opinion?" "Let my opinion be what it may," she replied. "I see no other way. The queen will be dead tomorrow. Our measures are in no forwardness. All is disconcerted since the last remove," meaning of Harley, Earl of Oxford, from being Lord Treasurer. "To make any attempt would be to ruin ourselves and help the establishment of those we hate. The successor must be immediately proclaimed. If we decline it, the Whigs will do it with the greatest clamour, and will not fail to fall on us for not doing it. By all means do it and receive the credit of it. Such is your only way." Queen Anne drew her last breath between 7 and 8 o'clock, August 1st, 1714, in the 50th year of her age and the 13th of her reign. Like her predecessor, she died on a Sunday morning. When the queen was released, the lords regents commanded Addison, whom they had appointed their secretary, to announce the important event to the prince whom the choice of the nation had appointed her successor. The celebrated author was completely overwhelmed with the importance of his task, and while he was culling words and phrases commensurate in dignity to the occasion, hours fled, hours of immense importance to the Protestant cause in England. At last the Regency was forced to call to its assistance Mr. Southwell, a clerk belonging to the House of Lords, who announced to the Elector of Hanover that the British sovereign was dead and that the throne was vacant, using the dry technical phrases best fitted for tidings received, if not without positive exultation, certainly without affectation of sorrow. On the Sunday morning, the proclamation of George I took place, says Thoresby, who witnessed it, "mightily to the satisfaction of all the people," of which there was the greatest concourse ever known, not only of the populace, but of the nobility and gentry, who attended in their coaches. The Bishop of London and vast numbers of the clergy were likewise present. The next day, this witness of the peaceable recognition of the line of Hanover went to prayer at St. Dunstan's, where King George was prayed for. 3 days afterwards, he saw the triumphant entry of the Duke of Marlborough, who returned from a sort of voluntary exile. He passed through the city of London in great state, attended by hundreds of gentlemen on horseback, and some of the nobility in coaches, followed by the city train bands. This array was made to intimidate those who were inimical to the Protestant succession, and these persons reflected, with the utmost bitterness, on Marlborough, for assuming a demeanour so joyous and triumphant, when the corpse was scarcely cold of his early friend and benefactress. His grand coach broke down at Temple Bar, much to the satisfaction of the Jacobites. A fortnight afterwards, the good old antiquary Thoresby visited Westminster Abbey to see the royal vault preparing to receive the corpse of Queen Anne. It was with difficulty he made his way through the immense crowds who thronged to gaze on the last resting place of their native princes. "It was affecting," says our moralist, "to see the silent relics of the great monarchs, Charles II, William and Mary, and Prince George, next whom remains only one space to be filled with her late majesty, Queen Anne. This sight was the more touching to me, because when young, I saw in one balcony 6 of them that afterwards were kings and queens of Great Britain, all brisk and hearty, but all now entered on a boundless eternity. These were then present: King Charles and his Queen Catherine, the Duke of York, the Prince and Princess of Orange, and the Princess Anne. He mentions with reverence the velvet, silver plates, nails, and hasps which adorned the royal coffins. But all this cost and magnificence is hidden from the eye, and now moulders with the silent dead. A vast mass of conflicting statements exists relative to Queen Anne, whose memory has experienced more than the accustomed portion of praise and blame which usually pertains to the royal dead. Anne never refused the royal assent to one bill tendered to her to be enacted into law. No person was put to death in her reign for high treason, circumstances which rendered it remarkable in English history. As to her privy purse, it was the poor's box, a perpetual fund for charity, and it appeared after her death, for she made no ostentation of her charities, nor were flatterers employed to trumpet them about. That several persons had pensions from the privy purse, pensions not given as bribes to do the dirty work of a minister, but merely out of charity for the support of indigent families. If she was frugal, it was to enable her to be generous, and she would have thought that she defrauded her people if she had been niggardly in order to lock up that money in chests which should circulate among them, or had sent it to foreign banks. And therefore all she could spare she returned back again to them as their right. It must be observed that all this was done without anything that looked like sordid saving, no retrenching her servants at their tables, allowances, or perquisites. The hospitality within doors was equal to the charity without. Dr. Radcliffe, who was a member of the House of Commons, was fiercely attacked there by a friend of his, who was rendered desperate by his sorrow for the demise of the Queen. To this, the physician replied by a letter of remonstrance, in which he thus mentions the deceased sovereign. The date is August 3, 1714. I could not have thought that so old an acquaintance and so good a friend, as Sir John always professed himself, would have made such a motion against me. God knows that my will to do her majesty any service has ever got the start of my ability, and I have nothing that gives me greater anxiety than the death of that glorious princess. I must do that justice to the physician that attended her in her illness, from a sight of the method taken for her preservation by Dr. Mead, as to declare that nothing was omitted for her preservation. But the political people about her, the plagues of Egypt fall on them. Put it out of the power of physic to be any benefit to her. I know the nature of attending crowned heads in their last moments too well to be fond of waiting upon them without being sent for by a proper authority. You have heard of pardons being signed for physicians before a sovereign's demise. However, ill as I was, I would have went to the Queen in a horse litter, had either her Majesty or those in commission next to her commanded me so to do. You may tell Sir John as much. His zeal for her Majesty will not excuse his ill usage of a friend. Thank Tom Chapman for his speech made in my behalf. I hear it is the first he ever made, which is taken more kindly. I shall be glad to see him at Carshalton, since the gout tells me that we shall never more sit in the House of Commons together. Dr. Radcliffe, who has been mentioned at the deathbeds of all the royal personages of the English Revolution, did not survive Queen Anne many months, and his death was reported to be in a manner connected with her own. There was a large portion of the people who passionately lamented the last of their native line of sovereigns, and with these, Dr. Radcliffe became an object of detestation, because the idea had gone forth among them that he might have saved good Queen Anne, and would not. It is said that he dared not quit his house on account of his dread of being torn limb from limb. Indeed, a letter of his is extant in which he affirms that he had received many threatening missives, promising that he should be pulled in pieces if he ventured to London. However, he was not a man to be intimidated, and it is evident by the conclusion of his letter above quoted that he knew his fiat had gone forth by reason of his personal ailments, and that he could never again sit in the House of Commons. He died on the 1st of November following, only surviving his royal patient 3 months. That the melancholy struggle of the unhappy queen, with conflicting rights and duties, brought her to the grave prematurely, is the expressed opinion of her domestic physician, Dr. Arbuthnot. There is true attachment and deep tenderness in the manner in which he speaks of the departed queen, when all regard to her memory was, to say the least, no great advantage to those who were seen to mourn for her. My dear mistress's days were numbered, even in my imagination. They could not exceed certain limits, but of that small number a great deal was cut off by the last troublesome scene of contention among her servants. I believe sleep was never more welcome to a weary traveler than death was to her. It surprised her suddenly, before she had signed her will, which no doubt her being involved in so much business hindered her from finishing. It was unfortunate that she had been persuaded, as is supposed by Lowndes, that it was necessary to have it under the Great Seal. I had figured to myself all this melancholy scene 20 times, and even worse, if that be possible, than happened, so I was prepared for it. My case is not half so deplorable as poor Lady Masham's and several of the Queen's servants, some of whom have no chance for their bread but the generosity of his present Majesty, that is George I, which several people that know him very much commend. Thus Lady Masham had not gathered riches, or even competence, by her services to Queen Anne. It will be remembered that her Majesty had been extremely opposed to Harley's resolution of making the humble attendant a peeress. No doubt the difficulty of building a competent fortune had perplexed the Queen. As to Queen Anne's will, the royal personages of the 17th and 18th century were convinced of the uselessness of such documents. "The wills of sovereigns are never obeyed after death," said Louis XIV not long afterwards. Perhaps as some counterpoise to their having their wills implicitly observed during life. The suspicions of the tendency of Queen Anne to the cause of her brother led the Whigs to a resolution of dethroning her, which there can be little doubt they would have perpetrated long before, had it not been for the moderation of her successors. Glanville, the member for Hythe, was heard to declare that the Queen and her ministers' designs for the Pretender were well known, and the opposite party had resolved that the Queen should not remain on the throne 1 fortnight, for which purpose they had 16,000 men in readiness, not, he added, to begin first, but to resist the intrusion of the Pretender. That prince himself was deceived by the hopes grounded on the revived affections of the Queen, his sister, to her family, if the following anecdote be authentic. The Chevalier St. George was at Luneville when he received the news of the mortal malady of his sister Queen Anne. He returned to Bar-le-Duc to be present at the assembling of his council. As he entered, he said, "If the Princess Anne dies, I am lost." Yet while Queen Anne remained free from delirium, it is evident that she made the strongest distinction between her crime of stigmatizing her brother as a spurious child, and the act, which was no crime, but an unavoidable necessity, of excluding him from the succession to the British throne as a Roman Catholic. It seems that her remorse for her sin regarding the first, which agonized her deathbed, has been too much confounded with her supposed intention of reversing the other, but there is no regal act of her life in contradiction to the settlement which strongly secured the succession to the Elector of Hanover. That prince, the next lineal heir to the throne of Great Britain, who was willing at the same time to tolerate the Church of England and to take the new coronation oath as a Protestant sovereign, was proclaimed the same day as George I, King of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, in perfect consistency with the moderation and honourable abstinence from intrigue to gain this vast extension of dominion, for which every one must allow George I due credit. His Majesty did not hasten his arrival in England, which remained 6 weeks without the presence of any sovereign, thus giving the people ample time by their acquiescence to confirm his succession. Lord Berkeley commanded the fleet which was dispatched to Orange Polder in Holland to await the embarkation of George I, according to his pleasure. The king did not hurry himself, for he arrived not at Greenwich until the 16th of September. The loss of Queen Anne was sincerely deplored in most pulpits throughout England, for she was deservedly beloved both by the clergy and the people. Dr. Sheridan, the friend of Swift, wrote an eloquent oration on the demise of his queen, which he preached with universal applause in Ireland. He had considered himself extremely happy in the choice of his text, as applicable to the 1st of August, the day of her demise. Sufficient for the day is the evil thereof. Subsequently, he was appointed chaplain to the then Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. He was requested by the Archdeacon to preach for him at Cork on the anniversary of the accession of George I, which was of course on the 1st of August. Sheridan, struck with the date, and entirely absorbed in his regrets for the last of the Stuart sovereigns, drew forth from some dusty nook his former sermon of lamentation for the loss of his royal mistress, and preached it with an energy and pathos that drew tears from himself and many a desponding Jacobite. Meantime, the Irish courtiers were transfixed with consternation. To preach an accession sermon with such a text, "Sufficient for the day is the evil thereof," was a piece of audacity only to be paralleled by the Papist White of Winchester's never-to-be-forgotten sermon at the funeral of the first Queen Mary, delivered before her sister and successor Elisabeth, the tenor of which was, that a living dog was better than a dead lion. Sheridan's sermon has been quoted as a remarkable effort of expiring Jacobitism. It was, however, but an instance of remarkable absence of mind, one of those practical Irish bulls for which he was noted. End of section 29. Section 30 of the Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 12, by Agnes and Elisabeth Strickland. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Anne, Chapter 12, Part 3. Fewer elegies and epitaphs were written on the death of Queen Anne than for any previous sovereign of Great Britain. The only ode commemorative of this queen of the High Church was the product of a dissenting muse. It is in vain to expect from Isaac Watts, in courtly poems, his own genuine style of holy simplicity, which has rendered his name deservedly illustrious. When William III had departed to his place, Watts dedicated an ode to his memory, which, in a fit of sectarian enthusiasm, he mistakes the king for an archangel and finds it difficult to distinguish between Gabriel or William on the British throne. Poetic beauty has long departed from royal elegies, and perhaps the performance of Watts equals any strain devoted to the monarchs of the Revolution, although in the course of it he does a little business in the courtier line by interweaving a curious eulogy on the advent of George I, the rising sun of himself and all his dissenting allies. Princess, the world already owns thy name. Go mount the chariot of immortal fame, nor die to be renowned. Fame's loudest breath too dear is purchased by an angel's death. But oh, the parting stroke! Some heavenly power cheer thy sad Britons in the gloomy hour. Some new propitious star appear on high, the fairest glory of the western sky, and Anna be the name. Britons, forgive the forward muse that dared prophetic seals unloose. George is the name, that glorious star. Ye saw his splendors beaming far, saw in the east your joys arise, when Anna sunk in western skies. 'Twas George diffused a vital ray, and gave the dying nations day. His influence soothes the Russian bear, calms rising wars, and heals the air. Joined with the sun, his beams are hurled to scatter blessings round the world, fulfilled whate'er the muse has spoke, and crowned the work that Anne forsook. Notwithstanding the paucity of elegiac odes on Queen Anne's death, her memory was cherished with no little affection, many years after her demise, by a distinguished class of her subjects. Swift, who is usually supposed to have been her enemy and calumniator, never speaks of her, but with deep reverence. In a remarkable letter, he mentions her as "our late blessed queen." In one of Lord Orrery's letters, dated as late as 1741, he says, "Lord Bathurst is at Cirencester, erecting statues and pillars to Queen Anne." Pope, in his poetical letter addressed to Lord Mansfield, when he was the elegant young Murray, the Apollo and Adonis of the English bar, gives a sigh of regret at once to his days of youth in her memory by alluding to "the golden days of my Queen Anne." Among the lower orders, for some years after her death, her name alone had power to agitate or excite them. In the reign of George I, the notorious Edmund Curll was doing penance in the pillory for some of his libelous publications when he took it into his head to say to the mob that he was put there for speaking well of the memory of good Queen Anne. Upon which, messieurs the mob laid aside the various missiles with which they had intended to assail him, and when he had stood his appointed time, escorted him to his own home with great respect. Edmund Curll had already lost both his ears for speaking amiss of the Parliament, these disgusting punishments not being abolished by the Revolution. It was an age when all of biography that was suffered to be connected with history was comprised in labored dissertations called characters. A moment's thought will suffice to show how partial or unjust a series of assertions must be, detached from narratives of the facts or supposed facts on which they are presumed to be based. In illustration of the fallacy of estimating royal personages, like Queen Anne or her sister, Mary II, by such performances, here follow two characters of Queen Anne, both penned by her domestic traitress and spy, the Duchess of Marlborough. The malignant character was composed by that person to ornament Bishop Burnet's History of his Own Times, meaning to wound the memory of her benefactress beneath the shelter of his shield. The bishop did not think fit to avail himself of the offered assistance. Queen Anne had a person and appearance not at all ungraceful till she grew exceedingly gross and corpulent. There was something of majesty in her look, but mixed with a sullen and constant frown that plainly betrayed a gloominess of soul and cloudiness of disposition within. She seemed to inherit a good deal of her father's moroseness, which naturally produced in her the same sort of stubborn positiveness in many cases, both ordinary and extraordinary, and the same sort of bigotry in religion. This passage being written for insertion in a party work appeals to vulgar opinion. The slight contraction in the Queen's eyes, the writer perfectly well knew, had been occasioned by violent inflammation in her childhood and was not connected with temper. The Duchess likewise well knew, and had experienced, that excessive indulgence, and not moroseness, in his family circle, was the fault of the unhappy James II, her early benefactor. However, this libel was not to be published under Bishop Burnet's mask. Thus does the creature of the bounty of those she maligns pursue her theme. Queen Anne's memory was exceedingly great, almost to a wonder, and had these two peculiarities very remarkable, that she could, when she pleased, forget what others would have thought themselves bound by truth and honor to remember, while she remembered all such things as others would have thought it a happiness to forget. Indeed, she chose to exercise it in very little, besides ceremonies and customs of courts, and such like insignificant trifles, so that her conversation, which otherwise might have been enlivened by so great a memory, was only made more empty and trifling by its chiefly turning upon fashions and rules of precedence, or some such poor topics. Upon which account it was a sort of misfortune to her that she loved to have a great crowd come to her, having little to say to them, but that the weather was either hot or cold, and little to inquire of them but how long had they been in town, or the like weighty matters. She never discovered any readiness of parts, either in asking questions or in giving answers. In matters of ordinary moment, her discourse had nothing of brightness or wit. In weightier matters, she never spoke but in a hurry, and had a certain knack of sticking to what had been dictated to her to a degree often very disagreeable, and without the least sign of understanding or judgment. As the Duchess was considered the Queen's dictator for 30 years, She had ample opportunity of speaking on this trait of her character, but it only became apparent to her when the dictatorship was transferred for a few years to another person. The Queen's letters, continues the Duchess, were very indifferent, both in sense and spelling, unless they were generally enlivened with a few passionate expressions, sometimes pretty enough, but repeated over and over again, without the mixture either of diversion or instruction. In point of orthography there was little to choose between the letters of the Queen and those of her censorer. They usually made the same mistakes. For instance, they both wrote wigs, W-I-G-S, when they mean wigs, W-H-I-G-S. And this, in the midst of an ardent political controversy, often gives laughable equivoques to their discussions. Swift or Addison may be permitted to censure the orthography of that day, which had vibrated between unsettled and obsolete words, but not a person who committed the same blunders with those she condemned in the Queen. Queen Anne's civility and good manners in conversation, to which the education of great persons naturally lead, were generally well enough, till in her latter days her new friends untaught her these accomplishments, and then her whole deportment was visibly changed to that degree, that when some things disagreeable to her own humour or passion have been laid before her, she would descend to the lowest and most shocking terms of contradiction. Her friendships were flames of extravagant passion, ending in indifference or aversion. Her love to the prince seemed, in the eyes of the world, to be prodigiously great, but great as was the passion of grief, her stomach was greater. I know that in some libels she has been reproached as one who indulged herself in drinking strong liquors, but I believe this was entirely groundless, and that she never went beyond such a quantity of strong wines as her physicians judged to be necessary for her. The testimony thus given, among a mass of malice and misrepresentation, ought to be considered conclusive in the Queen's favour, since there cannot exist a doubt that if the malignant writer could have mentioned only one instance in which she had seen the Queen guilty of this vice, she would have quoted it without scruple. Queen Anne's religion, continues the Duchess of Marlborough, was chiefly implicit faith, accompanied with the form and course of a sort of piety. She had a zeal for the church as for an infallible guide, and a devotion for churchmen to such a degree, as if she thought this sufficient to sanctify every other part of her conduct, and the churchmen repaid her civility in compliments and adorations. I have often blushed for her and her preachers, when I have heard it almost constantly affirmed to her face, with the most fulsome flattery, and to her great satisfaction, that all we enjoyed was granted by Almighty God as the reward of her piety and religion. And indeed, if religion consists in such zeal and such devotion, or in punctual and formal preparations for the communion, or the like, as she had learned, without doubt, from such tutors as she was blessed with, then it cannot be denied that she had as much religion as could be lodged in one breast. As the Duchess of Marlborough was a daring free thinker down to a late period of her life, and apparently departed in the same state of mind, her opinion on matters of religion is of little consequence. She breaks out into rage in her next paragraph, where she endeavours to prove many crimes on the poor Queen, which merely amount to the fact that the political course she had to pursue and her lately awakened affections were diametrically opposite. Anne was certainly not the worse woman because she did not persist, to the end of her life, in the obtuseness of feeling of which her uncle, Lord Clarendon, has left us so hideous a picture, when in 1689 she was acting under the domination of her favourite, who was even then her ungrateful calumniator. It is indisputable that, notwithstanding the agony of her internal remorse, the Queen expired without in any way impeding the settlement which the country had been necessitated to make of the succession. Therefore, the following malignant charges fall short of their mark. If religion, continues the Duchess, be justice, truth, sincerity, honour, gratitude, or the like, then one cannot tell what to say, but let Queen Anne's practice speak for itself. Her broken vows, her violated alliances, her behavior to her old friends at home, her conduct to her good allies abroad, and the return she made to her native country for an immense treasure of money and blood, spent for the vindication of her title and the security of her life. She would speak in public of her zeal for the Protestant succession, and once she surprised the nation with the news of a particular friendship between her and the House of Hanover. But God knows what she meant, unless it were to delude the ignorant part of her people, for as for her heart, there was proof enough, in due time, that it was engaged at another court, that is Saint-Germain. There was little of it left for the House of Hanover, and it came to be accounted an affront to herself to allude to it, in addresses to the throne. In most cases, Queen Anne was insensible of what related to the public, and could, with great coldness and tranquillity, let an express that was known to come with any important good news lie unopened for half an hour, though she was alone, and had nothing in the world to do, whilst all about her were waiting with the utmost impatience to know the contents of it. She loved fawning and adoration, and hated plain dealing, even in the most important cases. She had a soul that nothing could so effectually move as flattery or fear. How then came the person who is thus dissecting her character to be able to sway her royal benefactress for 30 years? Either she had recourse to the same base means, or, if Anne did not require them, her witnesses proved false and malicious. A sudden surprise in an unguarded moment would make the truth sometimes discover itself in her look or in some unlucky word, but if she had time and warning enough to learn her lesson, all the arguments and reasons in the world could extort nothing from her that she had not a mind to acknowledge. In such cases, she seemed to have the insensibility of a rock, and would resolutely dissemble, or disown anything in the world, and by repeating one single answer in the same words, could tire out the patience and elude all such inquiries as were disagreeable to herself. It is a serious loss to the world that the Duchess herself does not subjoin her own recipe for eluding a cross-examination when persons were pursuing a series of inquiries disagreeable to herself. According to her system of ethics, a queen regnant of Great Britain is criminal to the last degree, if not explicit in her answers to any questions the keeper of her gowns and cloaks chooses to ask her on state affairs. She had, continues the ungrateful recipient of 40,000 pounds of solid money, no native generosity of temper, nor was often known of herself to do a handsome action, either as a reward or as a piece of friendship. The diligence and faithfulness of a servant signified but little with her, where she had no passion for the person, and even, to such as she professed love, her presents were very few, and generally very insignificant, as fruit or venison, or the like, unless in cases where she was directed by precedents in former reigns. In a word, Queen Anne had little zeal for the happiness of others, but a selfishness that was great enough to make every other consideration yield to it. She was headstrong and positive in matters of the utmost importance, and at last preferred her own humour and passion before the safety and happiness of her own people and of all Europe, which she had either not sense enough to see, or not goodness enough to regard. Whether her memory will be celebrated by posterity with blessings or curses, time will show. Time has seldom shown a retribution more frightful than this vituperation on a mistress so bountiful to this calumniator as Queen Anne had been from her infancy. Now let us turn the medal and read the reverse inscription by the same truthful hand. Queen Anne had a person and appearance very graceful, something of majesty in her look. She was religious without affectation, and certainly meant to do everything that was just. She had no ambition, which appeared by her being so easy in letting King William come before her to the crown, after the king her father had followed such counsels as made the nation see they could not be safe in their liberty and laws without coming to the extremities they did. And she thought it more for her honour to be easy in it, than to make a dispute who should have the crown first that was taken from her father. and it was a great trouble to her to be forced to act such a part against him, even for security, which was truly the case, and she thought those that showed the least ambition had the best character. Her journey to Nottingham was purely accidental, never concerted, but occasioned by the great fright she was in when King James returned from Salisbury, upon which she said she would rather jump out of the window than stay and see her father. The deliberate falsehood of these assertions is proved by the letter of Anne to William, dated 10 years before she absconded, in which she very deliberately mentions her intended flight, nor was there any occasion to perform the hazardous gymnastic of leaping out of any of the windows of the cockpit into the park to run away, because the princess, by the advice of Lady Marlborough, had just had a pair of private stairs constructed, very convenient for the purpose of quietly walking out of the back door. But to proceed with this inimitable document. Queen Anne was never expensive, but saved money out of her £50,000 a year, which, after she came to the crown, was paid to Prince George of Denmark, which was his by right. She made no foolish building, nor bought one jewel in her reign. She always paid the greatest respect to Queen Mary and King William. Excepting a few trifling expressions, such as calling William Caliban, Dutch monster, and vulgar epithets, which occasionally occur in her correspondence with this candid friend, who, as King William's name was a strong party cry just then, thought it best to scratch them out of her letters. Yet as the Duchess of Marlborough made it a practice to show them to her party, a clue remained which renders them legible under the erasures. She never insisted upon any one thing of grandeur more than she had when her family, or her household, was established by King Charles II, though after the Revolution she was heiress presumptive to the crown, and after her sister, Queen Mary, died, was in the place of a Prince of Wales. The civil list was not increased on her having the crown, and Lord Godolphin, who was treasurer, often said that, from not straining things to hardships, her revenue did not come, one year with another, to more than £500,000. However, as it was found necessary to have a war to secure England from the power of France, she contributed, for the ease of the people, £100,000 out of her own revenue to lessen the expense in 1 year. Out of the civil list she paid many pensions, given in former reigns, which have been since thrown on the public. She gave the first fruits, to be distributed among the poor clergy. Queen Anne was extremely well bred. She treated her chief ladies and servants as if they had been her equals, and she never refused to give charity when there was the least reason for anybody to ask it. She likewise paid the salaries of most of her sister, Queen Mary's servants, notwithstanding the hardships she had suffered in King William's reign. And to show how good manager she was for the public, till a very few years before she died, she never had but £20,000 a year for her privy purse, which was vastly less than any king or queen ever had, but at the latter end of her reign she had £26,000, which was much to her honour, because that is subject to no account, and in comparison to other queens, namely of Mary II and Queen Caroline. Queen Anne was as saving in another office, that of the robes, for it will appear, by all the records in the exchequer where the accounts were passed, that in 9 years she spent only £32,050, including her coronation expenses. I have put these facts together for materials for the person who writes the inscription. And actually Dr. Hook compounded a most laudatory character of Queen Anne from this sketch, wisely omitting all the figments in the outset. Hook, as a Jacobite, well knew how daringly false the Marlborough versions of the escape from the cockpit were. This fine character of Queen Anne is still to be seen on the pedestal of her statue at Blenheim, where it stands to this day. Those who have read the preceding black portrait drawn of Queen Anne by the same person must think the contradictions between the two truly monstrous, and the emanation of a bewildered brain. Some candid persons disposed to sentimentalize on the fierce Duchess have supposed that after a lapse of time her mind had softened towards her benefactress, and that she wrote the last character as a reparation for the first. But such inferences vanish before the fact that the Duchess herself favors the world with her motives in raising the statue and making the laudatory inscription, the whole being avowedly not to do justice to Queen Anne, but to vex and spite Queen Caroline, the consort of George II. Here are her words. This character of Queen Anne is so much the reverse of Queen Caroline that I think it will not be liked at court. In the middle of the last century, the Duchess of Marlborough hated Queen Caroline more than she did Queen Anne. Such is the real explanation of these discrepancies. Other contemporary authors have mentioned traits of Queen Anne, according to their knowledge. When all are collected and examined, great contradictions occur, for they do not enough distinguish between the actions of Anne in her youth as an uneducated and self-indulgent woman, and the undeniable improvement in her conduct when the awful responsibility of a reigning sovereign, whose practical duties were, at that era, by no means clearly defined, awoke her conscience to trembling anxiety for the welfare of her people. Much permanent good she certainly did, and no evil as queen regnant, notwithstanding the ill-natured sarcasm of a Whig politician, who, when mentioning her demise at an opportune juncture for the Hanoverian succession, declared that Queen Anne died like a Roman for the good of her country. But no sovereign was ever more deeply regretted by the people. The office of regality was, there is no doubt, a painful occupation to her, for her constant complaint was, observes Tyndall, that she was only a crowned slave. The originality of which expression savours not of the dullness generally attributed to this queen. Her very person is represented differently by those who saw her daily. Her complexion was ruddy and sanguine. The luxuriance of her chestnut hair has already been mentioned. Her face was round and comely, her features strong and regular, and the only blemish in it was that defluxion, which had fallen on her eyes in her childhood, had contracted the lids and given a cloudiness to her countenance. Thus the frown that the Duchess of Marlborough dwells on malevolently did not arise from ill nature, but from defect of vision. The Duchess has likewise given a malignant turn to a trifling incident arising from Anne's nearsightedness quoted in her early life. Queen Anne was of a middle stature, observes another contemporary. Not so personable and majestic as her sister, Queen Mary. Her face was rather comely than handsome. It seemed to have a tincture of sourness in it, and for some years before she died, was rubicund and bloated. Her bones were small, her hands extremely beautiful, her voice most melodious, and her ear for music exquisite. She was brought up in high church principles, but changed her parties according to her interest. She was a scrupulous observer of the outward and visible forms of godliness and humility and public service, as, for instance, she reproved once the minister at Windsor Castle for offering her the sacrament before the clergy present had communicated, thus forgetting her position and dignity as head of the church. If one of the bitterest of all her revilers, Horace Walpole, may be believed, Queen Anne did not show reverence for the liturgy in her daily routine of private life. He says that when Queen Anne rose, prayers were read while her ladies dressed her, for the purpose of saving time, in the adjoining room. Now and then, the Queen's ladies considered it proper to shut the door. One day, a very devout but unworldly chaplain being on duty, he ceased reading when the door was shut, and to her great wrath, the lady of the bedchamber found he was not further advanced in the service, when she opened the door of the Queen's bedroom. "Why did you stop?" asked the lady angrily. "Because, madam," replied the uncompromising clergyman, "I do not choose to whistle the word of God through a keyhole." Whiston, a man of severe but rather fantastical tendency of belief, is always mentioned as the person who made this remarkable rejoinder. The incident is attributed, by all but Horace Walpole, to Queen Caroline, the consort of George II, and it is certain that Whiston was the chaplain of that queen, and not of Queen Anne, who disliked him on a charge of Socinianism. Her government likewise brought him into some trouble on account of his works being considered derogatory to the veneration due to the Holy Trinity. These circumstances totally acquit Queen Anne of this widely known but undeserved stigma, which has been fastened on her memory by the wicked wit of Horace Walpole, who thought the story too good to be lost and dared not give it to the right owner. Great ladies had in those days a bad custom of proceeding with the affairs of the toilet during prayers, which was severely satirized in one of the old plays of that era, where the fashionable belle is described preparing for her morning toilet by saying her prayers in bed to save time, while one maid put on her stockings and the other read aloud the playbill. The Duchess of Marlborough acquits her royal mistress of all this reckless profanity at private praying by abusing her as a godly, praying idiot, when in the seclusion of her chamber. Her life would have lasted longer, says another contemporary, who cannot forgive the harassed, world-wearied queen for dying at a political crisis, if she had not eaten so much, a propensity not derived from her father, King James, who was most abstemious, but from her mother. I say, continues Coke, she supped too much chocolate, and died monstrously fat, insomuch that the coffin wherein her remains were deposited was almost square, and was bigger than that of the prince, her husband, who was known to be a fat, bulky man. There are prints representing the queen's coffin when placed by her husband in the Stuart vault. If they may be depended upon, both Coke and Thoresby, who went to see the lying in state of Queen Anne, have exaggerated when they represented her coffin as a square every way. The queen's effigy in wax was certainly prepared for the purpose of being placed on her coffin. It is still in Westminster Abbey, and represents her as a very tall as well as a very stout woman. As it is the only funeral memorial that remains of this queen regnant, it ought not to be destroyed. The antiquarian, Thoresby, following the royal remains, and watched the final process which shut them from the world. The Lords Justices, that is, the Lords of the Regency, had resolved to bury the queen on Sunday, the 22nd of August, but as meantime they received letters from George I, with directions that her majesty's body should be interred with all the pomp and decency consistent with a private burial. The ceremony took place on Tuesday, the 24th, when she was buried in Henry VII's chapel with great solemnity. The difference implied by the terms public and private funeral seems to be that the latter took place at night or in the evening by torchlight. There had been, observes Thoresby, a new vault made on the south side of Henry VII's chapel, in which the corpse of Charles II and that of his nephew, William III, of Queen Mary and Prince George of Denmark lie. Here the remains of Queen Anne were deposited, and there being no more room left, the vault was bricked up, having thus received the last sovereign of the royal name of Stuart that was ever destined to wear the regal garland of this realm. No monument, not so much as the simplest tablet, marks the spot where Queen Anne rests, nor could the humblest female pauper that ever breathed her last in a workhouse repose less distinguished in death than this Queen of Great Britain. The Church of England owes her some memorial, for she deprived herself of much personal pomp and magnificence in order to benefit the Church, and she stands indubitably at the head of the short but illustrious list of Protestant founders. In ancient times, when a monastery or college was endowed, the tomb of the founder was carefully preserved and gratefully regarded through succeeding ages. But vainly may we ask for the monument of the foundress of the bounty which amplified the scanty livings of that church, the clergy of which are, as often observed, the worst and the best paid of any in the world. Although Queen Anne was, before she departed this life, on friendly terms with the King of France, she made no effort to afford sepulchre to the uninterred bones of her father, and that duty finally devolved on a distant kinsman. In fact, the body of James II remained unburied for a century after his daughter's death, and the circumstances regarding it form the last extraordinary incidents in the history of the regal personages of the House of Stuart. Lights were kept burning round the hearse of James II until the French Revolution. How strange that the bones of the stranger and the exile in the land should be reverenced, when those of the royal personages of France were disinterred and profaned! The church of the Benedictines in Faubourg Saint-Jacques were desecrated and turned into a cotton spinning factory. But when the revolutionists opened the coffin of James II, they found the corpse entire and in an extraordinary state of preservation. James had always been greatly beloved and revered in France, and at the sight of his remains, the crowd were seized with superstitious awe, and they defended them from those who would have destroyed them. The municipal authorities took possession of the hearse and body, but the people crowding to see them from all parts of Paris, and being willing to pay for the sight, the functionaries charged from a sou to a franc for admission, and made the show of our king's corpse a profitable concern. Will it be credited that in the midst of the infidelity of the Revolution, whispers went of miracles performed by the corpse of James II? Robespierre ordered the body to be buried, which was not done, but it was carefully and reverently preserved. When the Allies came to Paris in 1813, the body of the unfortunate James II still remained above ground, and the strange circumstance being mentioned to George IV, he generously ordered the bones of his kinsman to be carried in funeral procession from Paris to Saint-Germain and there interred in the church. The long-delayed funeral of James II then took place with royal grandeur. No mourners of his lineage attended his coffin on its return to Saint-Germain, for his race had passed away. Yet his people followed him to the grave, for most of the English in Paris, setting aside all religious and political differences, attended the cortege in the deepest mourning. The indications of respect were extraordinary. Every English person behaved as if following the coffin of a beloved sovereign who had died only the previous week. George IV ordered a monument to be raised in the church of Saint-Germain in the memory of his unfortunate predecessor. It is of white, gray, and black marble, and notwithstanding its simplicity, it possesses some elegance. An inscription in Latin marks the name and rank of the deceased, and the fact of his interment in 1813. James II is the only British sovereign deceased between the year 1603 and 1813 to whom a funeral monument has been raised. So closes the last historical incident relating to our ancient royal line. Postscript. As the following letter, the only specimen from the pen of Queen Anne in her girlhood, was still reposing inedited among the muniments of the noble family, to whose ancestress it was addressed when Volume 10 was printed, it is appended to the end of her life. Princess Anne of York to Lady Apsley, wife of Sir Alan Apsley. The commencement of the letter consists of excuses for not having written before. Brussels, September 20th. I was to see a ball, or I have been to see a ball, at the court incognito, which I liked very much. It was in very good order, and some danced well enough. Indeed, there was a prince votivant that danced extremely well as if not better than either the Duke of Monmouth or Sir E. Villiers, which I think is very extraordinary. Last night again I was, or I have been, to see fireworks and bonfires, which was to celebrate the King of Spain's wedding. They were very well worth seeing indeed. All the people here are very civil, and except you be otherways to them, they will be so to you. As for the town, it is a great fine town. Methinks, though, the streets are not so clean as they are in Holland, yet they are not so dirty as ours. They are very well paved and very easy. They only have odd smells. My sister Isabella's lodgings and mine are much better than I expected, and so is all in this place. For our lodgings, they were all one great room, and now are divided with board into several. My sister Isabella has a good bedchamber with a chimney in it. There is a little hole to put by things, and between her room and mine there is an indifferent room without a chimney. Then mine is a good one with a chimney, which was made a purpose for me. I have a closet and a place for my trunks, and there's a little place where our women dine, and over that such another. I doubt I have quite tired out your patience, so that I will say no more, only beg you to believe me to be what I really am, and will be your very affectionate friend, Anne. Pray remember me very kindly to Sir Alan. End of section 30. End of The Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 12, by Agnes and Elisabeth Strickland.